They tried to break my hand, sir, but I'll keep cooking. Those words, whispered through cracked lips and tears, would echo through Rattlesnake Hollow for generations. When a brutal father's fist met his daughter's defiance, when a stranger's kindness ignited a revolution, when justice arrived not with guns, but with quiet fury, that's when everything changed. This is the story of Lark McKenna, the cook who refused to break, and the rancher who made the impossible happen. Stay until the end to see how this incredible tale unfolds, and comment your city below so I can see how far Lark's story travels across the world. The desert had a way of keeping secrets. In the pre-dawn darkness of Rattlesnake Hollow, where the Arizona territory stretched endless and unforgiving, those secrets pressed heavy against the adobe walls of the McKenna homestead. The house stood alone, a weathered structure of sun-bleached wood and crumbling mortar, surrounded by nothing but sagebrush and silence. Inside, in a kitchen lit only by the dying embers of yesterday's fire, Lark McKenna worked with the practiced movements of someone who had learned to make herself small, invisible, necessary. Her left hand moved rhythmically through flour and water, kneading dough with a gentleness that belied the violence living in her bones. Her right hand, wrapped in strips of yellowed linen that had once been her mother's best tablecloth, hung useless at her side, the wrist beneath swollen to nearly twice its normal size, painted in shades of purple and black that looked like a storm trapped beneath skin. 3 days. It had been 3 days since her father had grabbed that wrist and twisted, his whiskey breath hot against her face, his words slurred but his intent crystal clear. "You don't talk back to me in my house, girl. You don't question me. You don't look at me like that." The snap had been audible. Even now, in the quiet of morning, Lark could hear it, that sickening crack that seemed to echo louder than her scream, louder than Prudence's delighted gasp from the doorway, louder than her father's laugh as he released her and reached for his bottle again. "Clumsy girl," he'd announced to no one in particular. "Always breaking things." Lark pressed her good hand deeper into the dough, feeling the resistance, the way it yielded and then pushed back. In another life, one where her mother hadn't died of fever when Lark was 12, one where her father hadn't found solace in rotgut whiskey and rage, one where he hadn't brought home Prudence with her cruel smile and crueler words, Lark might have become something different, someone different. But this was the only life she had, and in it, she was the cook. The title was both prison and sanctuary. As long as she could still prepare meals, as long as she could still make her father's coffee the way he liked it and fry his eggs without breaking the yolks, she had value. And as long as she had value, she had a reason to stay alive. Outside, the first hint of dawn began to paint the horizon in shades of gray. Lark moved to the hearth, using her good hand to coax the embers back to life, adding kindling with the careful precision of someone who couldn't afford to waste a single match. The flames caught, eager and bright, and in their light, the kitchen revealed itself in all its humble detail. This was her domain, her kingdom of cast iron and copper pots. The walls were lined with shelves her mother had insisted upon, back when such things as insistence and joy had existed in this house. Mason jars filled with preserved vegetables stood in neat rows, the work of Lark's hands over countless summers. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams, their shadows dancing in the firelight like memories of better times. A battered wooden table occupied the center of the room, its surface worn smooth by years of meals prepared, eaten, forgotten. And there, in the corner, where the morning light would eventually reach, sat the only thing Lark truly treasured, her mother's cookbook. It wasn't much to look at, a simple leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and stained, filled with her mother's careful handwriting. Recipes, yes, but also notes about life, small observations about the weather or the way herbs grew in certain seasons, little hearts drawn in the margins next to dishes that had been family favorites. Lark had spent countless hours poring over those pages, tracing her mother's words with her fingertips, imagining the hands that had written them, still strong and warm, not cold and still in a rough wooden casket. "Girl, where's my coffee?" The shout came from the bedroom, her father's voice rough with sleep and the lingering effects of last night's drinking. Lark's shoulders tensed reflexively, but her hands continued their work, moving with automatic efficiency. She'd learned long ago that responding to his voice with haste was expected, But responding with fear was weakness, and weakness invited more violence. She poured water into the tin coffee pot, measured grounds with the precision of a chemist, and set it over the flame. While it began to heat, she returned to her dough, shaping it into biscuits with her one good hand, using her wrapped wrist carefully to steady the bowl. Pain radiated up her arm with every small movement, sharp and insistent. She'd fashioned a crude splint the morning after, using wooden spoons and more of her mother's fabric, but she knew it wasn't enough. The bone had shifted wrong when it broke. She could feel it grinding against itself, a sensation that made her stomach turn. It needed a doctor's care, proper setting, perhaps even surgery. But there was no money for doctors. There was barely money for flour. And besides, her father had made his position clear. You want to see a doctor? Then earn the money yourself. Or better yet, maybe you should be more careful with your clumsy hands. The coffee began to boil, filling the kitchen with its bitter aroma. Lark poured a cup, black, no sugar, hot enough to burn, and carried it carefully down the narrow hallway to her father's room. She knocked once, a soft sound that wouldn't wake him if he'd fallen back asleep, but would acknowledge his summons if he was waiting. Come in, damn it. Lark pushed open the door with her shoulder, keeping her eyes downcast as she entered. The bedroom was dim and reeked of sweat and alcohol. Gideon McKenna sat on the edge of the bed, a large man gone soft around the middle, his face flushed even in the morning, his eyes perpetually bloodshot. At 45, he looked 20 years older, carved hollow by his own bitterness. Beside him, still in bed with the covers pulled demurely to her chin, lay Prudence. She was younger than Gideon by more than a decade, a woman who had arrived in Rattlesnake Hollow 6 months ago with nothing but a carpetbag and a smile that promised comfort. Gideon had married her within a week, desperate for companionship after 3 years of widowhood, blind to the calculation in her green eyes. Lark had seen it immediately. Prudence wasn't cruel because she enjoyed causing pain. She was cruel because she understood that in this household there was only room for one woman, and Lark's position as daughter and keeper of her mother's memory made her a threat. Took you long enough, Gideon muttered, snatching the cup from Lark's hand without looking at her. He drank deeply, winced at the heat, drank again. Biscuits ready? Soon, father. 20 minutes. 20 minutes is now, girl. I've got business in town today. I'm working as fast as I can with... Lark caught herself, swallowing the rest of the sentence. Drawing attention to her injury would be seen as complaint, and complaint invited retribution. But Prudence had already noticed. She sat up in bed, letting the covers fall just enough to remind everyone in the room that she was the mistress now, the one who shared Gideon's bed, the one who had replaced the irreplaceable. Oh dear, she said, her voice dripping with false concern. Is your hand still hurting, Lark? How terribly clumsy of you to fall like that. You really should be more careful around the woodpile. The lie had been established the night it happened. Lark had tripped, stumbled, fallen against the stack of firewood behind the house. An accident. Nothing more. Never mind that there were no splinters, no scrapes, no marks consistent with such a fall. Never mind that Prudence's eyes had glittered with satisfaction as she'd helped spread the story through town, her voice a perfect mask of sympathy. I'm managing, Lark said quietly, backing toward the door. I'll have breakfast ready shortly. She fled before either of them could call her back, her heart hammering against her ribs. In the kitchen, she focused on the physical tasks at hand, rolling out the biscuits, placing them in the Dutch oven, positioning it carefully in the coals to bake. Her hands shook slightly, and she hated herself for it, hated the fear that had become her constant companion, hated the small, broken things she'd become. But even as the self-loathing rose, another feeling stirred beneath it, something harder, sharper. Anger. She was tired, so profoundly, bone-deep tired of being afraid, of making herself small, of accepting that this was simply her life and always would be. She was 23 years old. Her mother had been married by 18, had birthed Lark by 19, had known love and partnership and the kind of marriage where two people built something together rather than tearing each other apart. Lark had known none of these things. She'd known only this kitchen, this house, this slow suffocation. As she worked, she found her gaze drifting to the window, to the vast emptiness beyond. Somewhere out there, people lived different lives. Women who weren't prisoners in their fathers' houses. Men who didn't rule with fists and fury, families where laughter wasn't a forgotten sound. But those were fairy tales, and Lark had stopped believing in fairy tales the day her mother died. The biscuits baked, filling the kitchen with the warm scent of bread and promise. Lark prepared plates, eggs fried in bacon grease, thick slices of ham from the smokehouse, the biscuits split and buttered. She carried the food to the table in the main room, setting places for 3 even though she wouldn't be eating with them. Servants didn't eat with the family, and that's what she was now, the help. Gideon appeared first, dressed for town in his leaf-stained shirt, his hair slicked back with water. He sat without ceremony and began eating, shoveling food into his mouth with the enthusiasm of a man who had never learned that meals could be savored rather than endured. Prudence followed, wearing a dress of pale green that Lark recognized as one of her mother's, altered to fit Prudence's slighter frame. The sight of it made Lark's chest tighten, but she said nothing. Everything that had been her mother's now belonged to Prudence. That was the way of things. "These biscuits are dry," Prudence announced, breaking one apart with her fingers and examining it critically. "Don't you agree, darling?" Gideon grunted, his mouth too full to respond properly. "Perhaps," Prudence continued, her eyes finding Lark where she stood by the kitchen doorway. "It's difficult to cook properly with only one good hand. Perhaps we should consider hiring someone more capable." The threat hung in the air, delicate and deadly. If Lark couldn't cook, she had no value. And if she had no value, "The biscuits are fine," Lark said, her voice steadier than she felt. "The recipe is Mother's. She made them the same way for 15 years. It was a mistake to invoke her mother, and Lark knew it the moment the words left her mouth. Prudence's face tightened and Gideon's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "Your mother," he said slowly, "is dead. And this is Prudence's kitchen now. If she says the biscuits are dry, then they're dry. You got something to say about that?" Lark forced herself to look at the floor, to make her body language submissive, apologetic. "No, Father, I'm sorry. I'll do better." "See that you do." He returned to his meal, dismissing her, but Prudence wasn't finished. She never was. "Gideon, darling, I've been thinking, perhaps it's time Lark considered finding work elsewhere. The Dawson Ranch is always looking for kitchen help, and it would give her a chance to spread her wings. A young woman shouldn't spend all her time in her father's house." The suggestion was poison wrapped in silk. The Dawson Ranch was 40 miles east, a hard-scrabble operation run by a man known for his wandering hands and his wife's willful blindness. Sending Lark there would be sending her to a different kind of hell. Lark's hands clenched into fists, the pain from her broken wrist flaring sharp and bright. She opened her mouth to protest, to beg, to promise she'd be better, cook better, be more invisible. But the sound of hoofbeats outside cut through the tension. All 3 of them turned toward the window as a rider approached, his silhouette dark against the rising sun. He was tall in the saddle, sitting with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent more of his life on horseback than off it. Even from a distance, there was something commanding about him, something that made the air itself seem to pay attention. Gideon stood, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Who the hell is that?" The rider drew closer, and Lark found herself drifting toward the window despite herself, drawn by something she couldn't name. As he came into focus, she saw a man in his mid-30s, broad-shouldered and lean, wearing the practical clothes of someone who worked the land, dark trousers, a worn leather vest, a hat that had seen its share of sun and storms. His face was tanned and angular, marked with the kind of lines that came from squinting into horizons and making hard decisions. But it was his eyes that caught her. Even at this distance, even through the wavy glass of the old window, Lark could see that they were different, calm and assessing, the eyes of someone who saw the world clearly and without illusion. He stopped his horse in front of the house and dismounted in one fluid motion. For a moment he simply stood there, his gaze traveling over the homestead, taking in the sagging fence line, the half-collapsed barn, the general air of neglect that had settled over the property since Gideon had given up caring about anything but his bottles. Then his eyes found the window, found Lark. She should have stepped back, should have retreated to the kitchen where she belonged. But she didn't. She stood frozen, caught in that gaze, feeling something shift inside her like a door opening in a room that had been locked for years. I said, "Who the hell is that?" Gideon repeated, heading for the door. Prudence had gone pale, her breakfast forgotten. "That's Jed Colt," she whispered, "the rancher from Silver Creek." Lark had heard the name before, in town gossip and whispered conversations. Jed Colt, who'd arrived in the territory 5 years ago with enough money to buy the old Sterling spread and turn it into one of the most successful operations in 3 counties. Jed Colt, who paid his men fair wages and kept his word. Jed Colt, who was said to be harder than the desert itself, but just as honest. What was he doing here? Gideon threw open the door, his posture aggressive, territorial. "This is private property, friend. State your business." Jed Colt climbed the 3 steps to the porch with unhurried precision. Up close, he was even more imposing, easily 6'3", with the kind of physical presence that came not from seeking confrontation, but from never backing down from it. "Mr. McKenna," his voice was deep and measured, each word chosen carefully. "Name's Jed Colt. I run the Silver Creek Ranch north of here." "I know who you are. What do you want?" "I'm looking for someone who can cook for my crew. Heard tell there might be someone here who fits the bill." His eyes moved past Gideon, past Prudence, who had appeared in the doorway, and landed on Lark with unerring accuracy. "That her?" The question hung in the air, and Lark felt her heart begin to race. A job. He was offering a job, a way out, a chance to leave this house, to earn her own money, to, perhaps— "She ain't available," Gideon said flatly. "I need her here." Wasn't asking if she was available. Was asking if she can cook. The distinction was subtle, but important, and Lark saw Gideon's jaw tighten. He wasn't used to being corrected, especially not on his own property. "My Lark's the finest cook in Rattlesnake Hollow," Prudence interjected, her voice honey-sweet now, calculating. "But as my husband said, we really do need her here. Of course, if the wages were substantial enough to compensate us for the inconvenience." Jed's gaze shifted to Prudence, and Lark saw something flicker in his expression, distaste perhaps, or simple understanding. He was reading the situation, she realized. Reading the dynamics of this broken household with the same clarity with which he'd probably assessed countless business deals. "I pay $3 a week," he said, his attention returning to Lark. "Plus room and board. Sundays off. Works hard but fair." $3 a week. It was more than generous. Most ranch cooks made half that. And room and board meant she'd be living on his property, away from this house, away from her father's fists and Prudence's poisoned tongue. It was everything she'd dreamed of and never dared to hope for. "She don't need room and board," Gideon growled. "She's got a home right here." "A home where she breaks her wrist falling into woodpiles?" Jed's voice remained level, but there was steel underneath now. His eyes had found Lark's makeshift splint, had noted the way she held her arm against her body, protecting it. Must have been quite a fall. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Lark felt Prudence tense beside her father, felt the sudden spike of danger in the air. Her father's temper was a living thing, volatile and unpredictable, and challenging him, even obliquely, was dangerous. "What are you implying?" Gideon took a step forward, his hands curling into fists. Jed didn't move, didn't even blink. "Not implying anything, Mr. McKenna. Just observing that a woman who can cook with a broken wrist must be pretty damn determined. That's the kind of person I want working for me." It was masterfully done, transforming an accusation into a compliment, diffusing the situation while simultaneously making his point clear. Lark felt something bloom in her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. "The answer's no," Gideon said flatly. "Now get off my property." "Fair enough." Jed touched the brim of his hat, a gesture of respect that somehow conveyed the opposite. "But if you change your mind, Miss McKenna, the offer stands. Silver Creek Ranch, 10 miles north of town. You come by any time, I'll give you a fair shake." He was speaking directly to her now, over her father's head, as if Gideon didn't exist at all. It was the most radical thing Lark had ever witnessed. A man treating her as if she had agency, as if her opinion mattered, as if she were a person rather than property. "She won't be coming by," Prudence said sharply, "and I'll thank you not to put ideas in her head, Mr. Colt. Lark is perfectly happy here with her family." Jed's eyes found Lark's one more time, and in them she saw a question. "Are you?" The answer rose in her throat, desperate and dangerous. No, I'm not happy. I'm dying here, slowly, by inches, and I don't know how much longer I can survive. But before she could speak, before she could even think about speaking, Gideon stepped between them, blocking her from Jed's view. I said, "Get off my property. Don't make me say it again." For a moment, Lark thought Jed might push back, might force the confrontation that was simmering just beneath the surface. But instead, he simply nodded once and turned, walking back to his horse with the same unhurried grace with which he'd arrived. He mounted up, gathered his reins, and paused. "Appreciate your time, Mr. McKenna, ma'am." This last was directed at Lark, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "Hope that wrist heals up proper." Then he was gone, riding back toward the main road, his horse's hoofbeats fading into the morning silence. Gideon slammed the door so hard the whole house shook. "Son of a bitch," he snarled, "coming onto my land, trying to steal my help. Who the hell does he think he is?" "A very wealthy man, darling," Prudence said carefully. "Perhaps it wouldn't hurt to consider—" "Consider what? Letting him walk all over me? Making me look weak in front of my own daughter?" Gideon's face had gone red, the familiar signs of a rage building. "No. The answer is no, and it stays no." He turned on Lark, and she took an instinctive step backward. "You put him up to this? You've been talking to people in town, making it sound like you're some kind of prisoner here?" "No, Father, I swear I never—" "Lying bitch!" His hand shot out, catching her across the face with enough force to snap her head sideways. Stars burst behind Lark's eyes, and she tasted blood. "You think I don't know what you're doing? Trying to make me look bad? Trying to turn people against me?" "Gideon, really?" Prudence began, but he rounded on her too. "You shut your mouth unless you want the same." Prudence fell silent, her eyes wide, and Lark realized with a sick sort of satisfaction that she was afraid. For all her manipulation, all her cruelty, Prudence was just as trapped as Lark was. Perhaps more so because she'd walked into this cage willingly, believing she could control the beast inside. Gideon breathed heavily for a moment, his rage a palpable thing. Then, with visible effort, he forced himself to calm down. "I'm going to town," he announced, "and when I get back I want this house spotless. You understand me, girl?" Lark nodded, not trusting her voice. "Answer me properly." "Yes, Father, I understand." "Good." He grabbed his hat from the peg by the door and stalked out, leaving a wake of tension behind him. Prudence stood frozen for a moment, then turned to Lark with an expression that was equal parts pity and contempt. "You brought that on yourself, you know. If you'd just kept your mouth shut, none of this would have happened." Then she too retreated, disappearing into the bedroom and closing the door firmly behind her. Lark stood alone in the suddenly empty house, her face throbbing, her wrist aching, her heart hammering in her chest. Slowly, carefully, she walked back to the kitchen and sank down onto the stool by the table. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the scarred wood, trying to steady herself, trying to breathe through the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. But even through the fear, even through the pain, one thought burned bright and clear. He saw me. Jed Colt had looked at her, not through her, not past her, but at her. He'd seen her broken wrist and known immediately that it was a lie, that the story about the woodpile was a fiction. He'd seen her trapped here, seen the prison of her existence, and he'd offered her a key. $3 a week, room and board, a life away from this house. It was impossible, of course. Her father would never allow it. And even if he did, what made her think she could actually do it? She'd never been more than 5 miles from this house. She'd never worked for anyone but her own family. She'd never been free. But God, how she wanted to be. Lark stood and moved to the window, looking out in the direction Jed had ridden. The landscape stretched empty and vast, full of possibilities and perils. Somewhere out there was Silver Creek Ranch. Somewhere out there was a different life. She touched her fingers to her swollen cheek, feeling the heat of the bruise already forming. This was her reality. This was what she had to work with. And if she wanted to survive, truly survive, not just exist, she was going to have to be smarter, more careful, more strategic than she'd ever been. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, Lark McKenna felt something other than despair. She felt angry. And anger, she was beginning to realize, could be a kind of fuel. The rest of the day passed in a blur of work and worry. Lark cleaned the house from top to bottom, her movements mechanical, her mind elsewhere. She scrubbed floors that had been scrubbed yesterday, dusted shelves that held no dust, beat rugs until her good arm ached almost as badly as her broken one. Physical labor was a refuge, a way to quiet the thoughts that chased each other in endless circles through her mind. What if I had said yes? What if I had walked out that door with Jed Colt and never looked back? What would have happened? But she knew what would have happened. Her father would have come after her. He would have made a scene, probably violent, possibly deadly. And even if she'd somehow made it to Silver Creek Ranch, what then? Her father knew where it was. He could show up any time, drag her back, punish her for her defiance. Unless, the thought formed slowly, dangerously, unless she wasn't his property anymore. Unless she had something that made her untouchable, untakeable. But what could a woman like her possibly have that would hold that kind of power? The afternoon sun was slanting through the windows when Lark heard the rattle of wagon wheels outside. She looked up from the vegetables she was chopping for dinner to see a wagon pulling into the yard, driven by a woman she recognized as Mrs. Chen from the general store in town. Lark wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door confused. The Chens didn't make deliveries. People went to them. What was Mrs. Chen doing here? The older woman climbed down from the wagon with practiced ease, adjusting her sun hat as she approached. "Miss McKenna," she said, her weathered face kind. "Afternoon." "Mrs. Chen, is something wrong?" "Wrong? No, I'm here with a delivery." She gestured to the back of the wagon where a large basket sat covered with a clean cloth. "A delivery? But we didn't order anything." "Not from your father, no. This came with instructions to deliver it to you specifically, from Mr. Jed Colt." Lark's heart skipped. "What?" Mrs. Chen smiled, and it was a knowing sort of smile, the kind exchanged between women who understood the world was harder for some than others. "Come see." Lark followed her to the wagon, her pulse racing. Mrs. Chen pulled back the cloth, revealing the contents of the basket: flour, fresh eggs, a tin of coffee, sugar, dried fruit, and most surprisingly, a small jar of honey. "There's a note," Mrs. Chen said, producing a folded piece of paper from her apron pocket. Lark took it with trembling fingers and opened it. The handwriting was strong and clear, surprisingly elegant for a rancher. "Miss McKenna, for the cook. Quality ingredients make quality meals. The offer still stands whenever you're ready. J.C." It wasn't signed with his full name, just initials, a small discretion perhaps, in case the note fell into the wrong hands. But the message was clear. He was still thinking about her, still offering her a way out. "Mr. Colt paid top dollar for these supplies," Mrs. Chen said quietly, "and he asked me specifically to deliver them when your father wasn't home. I expect he knew what he was doing." "Thank you," Lark whispered, her voice thick. "Thank you for bringing them." Mrs. Chen studied her for a long moment, taking in the bruise on her cheek, the wrapped wrist, the way Lark held herself like someone expecting a blow. Her expression softened. "You're a good girl, Lark. Your mama would be proud of the woman you've become. And if you ever need, if you ever need anything, you come see me. Understand? We women have to look out for each other in this world." Before Lark could respond, Mrs. Chen had climbed back onto her wagon and was turning it around, heading back toward town. Lark stood in the yard, clutching the basket, feeling the weight of possibility. He'd sent her provisions. Not flowers, not jewelry, nothing romantic or inappropriate. He'd sent her the tools of her trade, an acknowledgement of her skill, a statement of respect. And he'd done it carefully, thoughtfully, in a way that wouldn't immediately provoke her father's rage. Lark carried the basket inside and set it on the kitchen table, running her fingers over the smooth surface of the flour sack, the cool glass of the honey jar. These were expensive items, particularly the coffee and honey. A week's wages for most men, spent on supplies for a woman he'd met for 5 minutes. Why? The question nagged at her as she put the supplies away, as she finished preparing dinner, as the afternoon wore into evening. Why would a successful rancher like Jed Colt take an interest in her? What did he see when he looked at her that made him willing to spend his money, risk her father's ire, involve himself in the messy business of another man's household? She was still pondering this when her father returned, stumbling through the door well after dark, reeking of whiskey and tobacco. He was in a foul mood, muttering to himself about uppity rich bastards and people who don't know their place. Lark had dinner ready, stew made with the fresh vegetables from her garden and some of the better ingredients from Jed's basket, though she'd hidden most of those supplies away where they wouldn't be immediately noticed. She served him in silence, then retreated to the kitchen while he ate and drank, and eventually passed out in his chair. Only when his snores filled the house did Lark finally allow herself to relax. She moved quietly to her small room off the kitchen, barely more than a closet really, with space only for a narrow bed and a single shelf for her few possessions. She lit a candle and pulled out her mother's cookbook, turning to a page she'd read 1,000 times. It was her mother's recipe for honey cake, written in her careful hand, with a note at the bottom. This was my mama's recipe, and her mama's before her. When you make it, you're connected to all the women who came before, all the hands that kneaded and mixed and poured love into every bite. Lark traced the words with her finger, feeling that connection like a physical thing. Her mother, her grandmother, her great-grandmother, all of them had survived. They'd endured hardship and loss, found ways to carve out joy in difficult lives. They'd persisted, and so would she. Tucked into the back of the cookbook, hidden between pages of pie recipes, was Jed Colt's note. Lark pulled it out and read it again by candlelight. The offer still stands whenever you're ready. When? Not if. As if he already knew she'd say yes eventually, as if it were simply a matter of time and courage. Maybe he was right. Lark folded the note carefully and returned it to its hiding place. Then she lay down on her narrow bed, her broken wrist throbbing, her cheek tender, her body exhausted, but her mind racing. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. Her father's anger would still be there, and Prudence's cruelty, and the grinding reality of her trapped existence. But tomorrow would also bring the possibility of change, because somewhere out there, 10 miles north of town, was a man who'd looked at her and seen not a possession, not a servant, but a person, a cook who was worth fighting for, and maybe, just maybe, worth saving. Over the following weeks, something shifted in the rhythm of Lark's existence. The basket of supplies had been only the beginning. 3 days after Mrs. Chen's delivery, Lark found a small burlap sack on the back porch when she went out to draw water at dawn. Inside were 6 perfect apples, their skins still cool with morning dew, and a note in that same strong handwriting. For pies. The men miss proper dessert. A week later, another delivery arrived. This time, a young ranch hand rode up while Gideon was in town, tipped his hat respectfully, and handed Lark a parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a pound of real butter, pale yellow and fresh, the kind that cost more than Lark typically saw in a month. No note this time, but she knew who it was from. Each gift was practical, thoughtful, carefully chosen to be useful rather than romantic. Nothing that could be construed as courtship, nothing that would give Prudence ammunition for her insinuations. Just supplies for a cook, delivered by a man who appreciated good food and recognized talent when he saw it. But Lark understood the deeper message. She wasn't forgotten. The offer still stood. And more than that, Jed Colt was patient. He wasn't pushing, wasn't demanding an answer. He was simply there, a steady presence at the edge of her awareness, waiting until she was ready. The gifts transformed her cooking in ways both practical and profound. With real butter and fresh spices, with quality flour and actual sugar to work with, Lark created meals that transcended mere sustenance. Her biscuits became lighter, her stews richer, her desserts the kind that people remembered long after the last bite. Even Gideon noticed, though he'd never admit the improvements came from another man's generosity. Finally learning to cook proper, he'd grunt through mouthfuls of apple pie. About damn time. Prudence, however, was less easily fooled. She'd found one of the empty flour sacks, higher quality than anything they bought from the general store, and had confronted Lark about it one afternoon while Gideon was working on the fence line. "Where did this come from?" Prudence demanded, holding up the sack like evidence in a trial. Lark kept her hands moving through the dough she was kneading, not looking up. "Mrs. Chen, she had extra stock and gave me a good price." "With what money? Your father certainly didn't give you anything extra." "I had some saved from mending work." It was a plausible lie. Lark did occasionally take in mending from neighbors, earning a few cents here and there, but Prudence's eyes narrowed, clearly unconvinced. "That rancher," she said slowly. "Colt. He's been sending things, hasn't he?" Lark's hand stilled for just a fraction of a second, long enough for Prudence to notice. The older woman's face hardened with satisfaction. "I knew it." "What does he want, Lark? Men like that don't give away expensive supplies out of the goodness of their hearts. What have you promised him?" The insinuation was clear and ugly. Lark felt heat rise in her cheeks, anger mixing with humiliation. "Nothing. I've promised him nothing because I haven't spoken to him since the day he came here." "But he's spoken to you, hasn't he? Through these little gifts. He's trying to buy you." "He's trying to help me." The words came out sharper than Lark intended, and she saw Prudence's expression shift from suspicion to calculation. "Help you do what exactly? Leave? Is that what this is about? You think you can just walk away from your responsibilities here?" "I have no responsibilities here except to cook and clean and take whatever violence comes my way." Lark's voice was rising now, months of suppressed rage finally finding voice. "I'm not his daughter. I'm his servant. And you've made sure I know that every single day since you arrived." Prudence's hand moved so fast Lark barely saw it coming. The slap caught her across the same cheek her father had struck weeks ago, reopening the barely healed split in her lip. Lark tasted blood, copper, and salt mixing with the flour dust in the air. "How dare you?" Prudence hissed. "How dare you speak to me that way? I'm the mistress of this house." "You're a woman who married a drunk for his land and found out too late that the land's mortgaged to the bank and the man's mortgaged to the bottle." The words poured out of Lark like poison finally lanced from a wound. "You're as trapped as I am, Prudence. The only difference is I didn't walk into this cage voluntarily." For a moment, Prudence simply stared, her face pale with shock. Then something crumpled in her expression, something that looked almost like recognition. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, more dangerous. "If you tell Gideon about the supplies, I'll make sure he beats you so badly you'll never cook again. Do you understand me?" It wasn't a threat, it was a statement of fact, and they both knew it was true. "I won't tell him," Lark said quietly. "But you won't either, because if you do, you'll have to explain how you knew about them. And then he'll know you've been watching me, searching my things, suspecting me. He won't like that." They stood in tense silence, two women locked in a battle neither could truly win. Finally, Prudence turned and walked away, her spine rigid with barely contained fury. Lark sagged against the table, her legs suddenly weak. That had been stupid, incredibly, dangerously stupid. She'd revealed too much, pushed back too hard. Prudence would find a way to make her pay for it. But God, it had felt good to finally say the truth out loud. That night, Lark lay in her narrow bed and listened to the sounds of the house settling around her. Gideon's snores rumbled through the thin walls. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called out to the moon. And in her mind, Lark composed a letter she'd never send to a man she barely knew. "Dear Mr. Colt, thank you for the supplies. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for offering me a different life. I want to say yes. I want to walk out of this house and never look back. But I'm afraid. Not just of my father's anger, though that's real enough. I'm afraid I don't know how to be anything other than what I am now. I've been small and silent and scared for so long, I don't know if I remember how to be anything else. What if I come to Silver Creek and I'm not good enough? What if I fail? What if freedom is something I'm not strong enough to hold?" She fell asleep with those unwritten words circling through her mind, questions without answers, fears without solutions. The next morning brought unexpected change. Lark was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast in the pre-dawn darkness, when she heard riders approach. Multiple horses, moving at a steady pace. She moved to the window and saw 3 men dismounting in the yard, and one of them was Jed Colt. Her heart began to hammer. What was he doing here, and why had he brought others? Gideon must have heard the horses too, because he emerged from the bedroom already bellowing. "What in the hell?" But he stopped short when he opened the door and saw who was standing on his porch. Jed, flanked by 2 other men Lark didn't recognize. One was older, with silver hair and a marshal's badge glinting on his vest. The other was younger, dressed in a suit that marked him as someone from town, someone official. "Mr. McKenna," Jed said, his voice carrying that same measured calm. "Morning. Hope we didn't wake you." "What do you want, Colt? And why'd you bring the law to my property?" The marshal stepped forward, pulling a document from his coat pocket. "Mr. McKenna, I'm Marshal Webb. This here's Mr. Patterson from the bank. We've got some business to discuss with you." Gideon's face went pale, then red. "Business? What kind of business?" "The kind involving debts, Mr. McKenna." Patterson's voice was crisp, professional. "You're 3 months behind on your mortgage payments. The bank has been patient, but our patience has limits." Lark's hand went to her mouth. 3 months behind? How was that possible? Her father had always managed to make the payments, even if it meant they went without other things. What had changed? But she knew what had changed. Prudence had changed things. Prudence with her fancy dresses and her demands for store-bought goods, and her insistence on maintaining appearances in town. Money that should have gone to the bank had gone instead to keeping up the fiction that the McKennas were respectable, successful, not drowning in debt and desperation. "I'll catch up," Gideon said, but there was a desperate edge to his voice now. "Just need a little more time. The cattle—" "What cattle?" Patterson's voice was flat. "You sold off most of your herd 6 months ago, and from what I hear you drank through the profits. You've got maybe a dozen head left, not enough to cover what you owe." "Then I'll sell something else. The house is collateral for the loan, Mr. McKenna. It's not yours to sell." Patterson's expression wasn't cruel, but it was implacable. "The bank is prepared to foreclose unless you can provide payment in full within 30 days. 30 days? That's impossible. You can't do this." "We can, and we are." The banker turned to leave, but Jed Colt spoke up. "How much does he owe?" Everyone turned to look at him. Patterson consulted his papers. $847, plus accumulated interest. It was an astronomical sum, more money than Lark had ever seen in her life, more than her father could earn in 2 years, even if he worked every day and stopped drinking entirely. "I'll cover it," Jed said simply. The silence that followed was absolute. Lark felt the world tilt sideways, her understanding of reality shifting beneath her feet. Gideon's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. Even the marshal looked surprised. "Mr. Colt," Patterson said carefully, "that's a substantial amount of money." "I'm aware. I'll have it transferred from my account by end of business today." Jed's gaze fixed on Gideon. "In exchange, Mr. McKenna transfers the deed to me. The house, the land, everything." "Now wait just a goddamn minute." Gideon started forward, but Marshal Webb stepped between them. "Let's all stay calm here. Mr. Colt, you understand what you're proposing. You'd be taking on Mr. McKenna's debt in exchange for property that ain't worth half that much." "I understand perfectly." Jed's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "Do we have a deal, McKenna?" Gideon's face had gone through several shades of red and settled on a kind of mottled purple. "You son of a bitch. This is what you wanted all along, isn't it? You weren't trying to hire my daughter. You were trying to steal my land." "Your land was already gone," Jed said quietly. "You lost it the day you stopped being able to make your payments. I'm just offering you a way out that doesn't involve the bank throwing you into the street. I'll work it off. You'll drink it away," Patterson interjected. "Mr. Colt's offer is more than generous, frankly. It's the best deal you're going to get." From inside the house, Prudence appeared, wrapped in a dressing gown, her face pale with shock. She'd heard everything, Lark realized. She knew exactly what was happening. "Gideon?" Prudence's voice shook. "Maybe we should consider—" "Shut up!" Gideon rounded on her. "This is your fault. Your spending, your demands, your—" He cut himself off, breathing hard. Then he turned back to Jed, and Lark saw something break in his expression, pride giving way to desperation. "If I agree, where would we go?" "That's your concern, not mine." Jed's tone wasn't unkind, but it was firm. "Though I hear the Dawson Ranch is hiring hands, comes with a bunkhouse room." The implication was clear. Gideon would go from landowner to hired help, from master of his own domain to just another cowboy taking orders. It was the ultimate humiliation for a man who'd built his entire identity around being his own boss. But it was also survival. and they all knew it. "What about Lark?" Prudence asked suddenly. All eyes turned to her. "If you're taking the house, what happens to her?" Jed's expression didn't change. "That's up to Miss McKenna, but my original offer still stands. She can cook for my crew, make her own wage, live on my property. Or she can do whatever else she chooses. She's a free woman." The words hung in the air like a benediction. Free woman. When had Lark last been free? Had she ever been? Gideon was staring at the ground now, his shoulders slumped. He looked old suddenly and small, all the bluster and violence drained away, leaving only a tired, defeated man who'd gambled everything and lost. "Fine," he said, the word barely audible. "Fine. I'll sign your damn papers." Patterson produced documents from his case, spreading them across the porch railing. The marshal witnessed as Gideon signed his name in a shaking hand, transferring ownership of everything he'd ever possessed to a man he'd met twice. When it was done, Jed folded the papers carefully and handed them to Patterson. "I'll have the money to the bank by 3 o'clock today." "Appreciate your business, Mr. Colt." Patterson tipped his hat and headed for his horse. Marshal Webb lingered a moment longer, his gaze moving from Gideon to Lark to Jed and back again. "You folks sort this out peaceable now, you hear? I don't want to come back out here for anything that ain't peaceable." "Won't be necessary, Marshal," Jed assured him. When the lawmen had ridden off, Jed finally turned his full attention to Lark. She stood in the kitchen doorway, still in her flour-dusted apron, her wrapped wrist pressed against her chest. Their eyes met, and she saw in his gaze a question that needed answering. "Miss McKenna," he said formally, "I meant what I said. You're welcome at Silver Creek any time. But if you'd prefer to make other arrangements, I respect that. This is your choice." "Her choice?" Gideon's voice was venomous. "She don't get a choice. She's my daughter, and she goes where I go." "She's a grown woman," Jed countered, "and this is America. She can do as she pleases." "Over my dead body." "That can be arranged." The words were soft, almost gentle, but they carried an unmistakable promise. Jed's hand hadn't moved toward the gun at his hip, but everyone present understood that it could, very quickly. Gideon took a step back, some of his old fear reasserting itself. He wasn't so drunk or angry that he'd challenge an armed man who had every legal right to be standing where he was. Lark found her voice, though it came out smaller than she wanted. When do you need an answer?" "Take your time," Jed said. "I'll be back tomorrow to make arrangements for the property. You can let me know then." He paused, then added quietly, "But Miss McKenna, you should know that as of right now, this land belongs to me, which means anyone living on it does so at my discretion. I'm a reasonable man, but I expect reasonable behavior in return." The warning was clear. Gideon could stay until he found other arrangements, but his days of ruling this house with violence were over. This was Jed's property now, and he wouldn't tolerate abuse under his roof. Gideon understood too. His face twisted with impotent rage, but he said nothing, just turned and stalked into the house. Prudence stood frozen on the porch, looking between Jed and Lark like a woman watching her entire world collapse. "What will we do?" she whispered. "That's for you and your husband to figure out," Jed said, not unkindly. "But I suggest you start packing. I'll want possession of the house within the week." He mounted his horse in one fluid motion, then looked down at Lark one last time. "Think about it," he said. "And Miss McKenna, whatever you decide, make sure it's what you want, not what anyone else wants for you." Then he was gone, riding back toward Silver Creek, leaving chaos in his wake. Lark stood in the yard long after the dust from his horse had settled. Inside she could hear Gideon shouting, furniture being thrown, Prudence's voice rising in shrill defense, the sounds of everything falling apart. But Lark felt strangely calm. For the first time in her life, the choice was truly hers to make. Stay or go. Remain trapped in the patterns of her past, or step forward into an unknown future. The decision should have been impossible. Should have required days of careful consideration, weighing of options, analysis of risks. But Lark knew her answer. She'd known it the moment Jed had looked at her and called her a free woman. She turned and walked back into the house. No longer her father's house, but Jed Colt's property, and by extension, a place where she was protected rather than prisoner. She went to her small room and pulled her mother's cookbook from its hiding place. Then she gathered what few possessions she could call her own: 2 dresses, a pair of worn boots, a shawl her mother had knitted, the broken pieces of her mother's wedding china that Gideon had smashed in a drunken rage years ago. Everything fit into a single carpet bag. It was shocking, really, how little she had to show for 23 years of existence. But perhaps that was the point. She'd been living half a life, a shadow existence. Maybe it was time to become substantial. Prudence appeared in the doorway, her eyes red from crying. "You're leaving." It wasn't a question. Lark nodded, not trusting her voice. "I suppose I can't blame you," Prudence said softly. "If I had somewhere else to go, I might do the same." She was quiet for a moment, then added, "He'll try to stop you, you know. Gideon, he'll see it as the ultimate betrayal." "He can try." Lark closed the carpet bag and faced her stepmother. "But he doesn't own me anymore. Nobody does. That rancher, Colt, you barely know him. I know he's never hit me. I know he offered me work, not charity. I know he just paid nearly $1,000 to free me from this house." Lark's voice was steady now, certain. "That's more than enough to know." Prudence studied her for a long moment, and something like respect flickered in her expression. "You're stronger than I thought. Stronger than your mother, maybe. My mother loved my father when he was a different man. She stayed because she believed he could change back into that man." Lark shouldered her bag. "I don't have that kind of hope, or that kind of foolishness." She walked past Prudence, through the kitchen one last time, past the hearth where she'd cooked countless meals, past the table where she'd eaten in silence while others laughed and talked around her. The house that had been her entire world suddenly seemed small, suffocating. She stepped out into the afternoon sun and didn't look back. The walk to town took 2 hours. Her wrist ached with every step, and the carpet bag grew heavier with each mile. But Lark kept moving, putting distance between herself and the only home she'd ever known. Town was quiet when she arrived, the main street drowsy in the late afternoon heat. Lark went straight to the general store, where Mrs. Chen was rearranging canned goods on a shelf. The older woman took one look at Lark, dusty from the road, carrying her worldly possessions, determination written in every line of her body, and smiled. "You're going to him," she said. "How did you pull—" "The whole town knows what happened this morning. News travels fast in Rattlesnake Hollow." Mrs. Chen came around the counter. "Jed Colt paid off your father's debts and took the McKenna place. Half the town scandalized, other half saying it's about time someone took Gideon McKenna down a peg. I need directions to Silver Creek Ranch. 10 miles north on the main road, then west at the old lightning-struck tree. You can't miss it, biggest spread in the county." Mrs. Chen hesitated. "It's a long walk, dear, and it'll be dark soon." "I'll manage." "Or," Mrs. Chen said thoughtfully, "you could wait until morning. My husband's making a delivery run north tomorrow. He could drop you at the ranch gate." It was a practical suggestion, but Lark shook her head. "If I wait, I might lose my nerve. I need to do this now." Mrs. Chen nodded understanding. She disappeared into the back room and returned with a canteen of water and a small package wrapped in waxed paper. "Bread and cheese, you'll need your strength." "I can't pay you." "Consider it an investment in your future." Mrs. Chen pressed the items into Lark's hands. "Now go. And Lark, don't let anyone make you feel like you're running away. Sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do is run toward something better." The words stayed with Lark as she left town, as she walked north along the dusty road, as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. She wasn't running away. She was running toward freedom, toward choice, toward a life where her value wasn't measured in how quietly she could endure suffering. The miles passed beneath her feet. Her legs ached, her wrists throbbed, exhaustion pulled at her with every step. But Lark didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Momentum was the only thing keeping her moving forward, and if she lost it now, she might never find it again. Darkness fell, and with it came the desert cold. Lark wrapped her mother's shawl tighter around her shoulders and kept walking, guided by moonlight and the certainty that she was finally doing something for herself. It was near midnight when she saw the lights of Silver Creek Ranch glowing in the distance, like a promise. The main house was larger than she'd expected, a sprawling structure surrounded by outbuildings and corrals. Even in the darkness, she could see that this was a prosperous operation, well-maintained and organized. Lark stopped at the gate, suddenly uncertain. What was she doing showing up in the middle of the night like some kind of desperate vagrant? She should have waited until morning, should have sent word ahead, should have... Miss McKenna? The voice came from her left, and Lark spun to find Jed emerging from the shadows near the barn. He was in shirt sleeves despite the cold, and she realized he must have been working late, tending to some night task or another. Mr. Colt! Her voice came out small, embarrassed. I'm sorry to arrive so late. I should have waited until... You walked? He was staring at her carpet bag, at her dusty clothes, at the determination written in every exhausted line of her body. You walked 10 miles in the dark? Yes. I made my decision. About your offer. She swallowed hard. If it still stands, I'd like to accept. I'd like to cook for your crew. Jed was quiet for a long moment, and in the moonlight, Lark couldn't read his expression. Had she made a mistake? Was the offer no longer valid? Had she burned her bridges with her father for nothing? Then he stepped forward and took the carpet bag from her shoulder, the gesture so gentle it made her throat tighten. Of course it still stands, he said quietly. Come on, let's get you inside and fed. Everything else can wait until morning. He led her toward the main house, and Lark followed, her legs shaking now that she'd finally stopped moving. The door opened into a large kitchen, warm and well lit, the kind of space a cook could dream about. There was a massive stove, work surfaces that actually had space to spread out, shelves stocked with supplies and equipment. Sit, Jed ordered, pulling out a chair at the large wooden table. When's the last time you ate? This afternoon. Mrs. Chen gave me, but he was already moving, stoking the fire in the stove, pulling out bread and cold meat, slicing cheese with practiced efficiency. Within minutes, he'd assembled a meal and placed it in front of her along with a glass of milk. Eat, he said simply. Then we'll figure out where you're sleeping tonight. Lark ate, too hungry and tired to be self-conscious about her manners. The food was simple but good, and each bite seemed to anchor her more firmly to this new reality. She was here. She'd actually done it. She'd left her father's house and walked through the darkness to a new life. When she'd finished, Jed poured her a cup of coffee and sat across from her. I need to know something, he said. Are you here because you want to be or because you feel like you have no other choice? The question startled her with its directness. Lark set down her cup and met his eyes. Both, she said honestly. I want to be here. But you're right that I don't have many other choices. Does that matter? Maybe. Maybe not. He leaned back in his chair. I want to be clear about what I'm offering and what I'm not. This is a job, Miss McKenna. You'll work hard, same as everyone else on this ranch. You'll cook 3 meals a day for 15 to 20 men, depending on the season. You'll maintain the kitchen, plan the supplies, make sure everyone's fed properly. In exchange, you get $3 a week, a room in the main house, and Sundays off. That's it. That's all this is. I understand. Do you? His gaze was searching. Because your father's going to say I took advantage of you, that I manipulated the situation to get what I wanted. Half the town's probably thinking the same thing. Let them think what they want. Lark's voice was stronger now. You offered me work, and I accepted. Everything else is just noise. Something shifted in Jed's expression, a tension easing. All right then, we'll start fresh tomorrow. For tonight, there's a room upstairs, second door on the left. It's small, but it's clean. Bathroom's at the end of the hall. Get some rest. You look like you're about to fall over. Lark stood, swaying slightly as exhaustion crashed over her in a wave. Thank you, she managed, for everything, for the supplies, for paying off the debt, for... Don't thank me yet, Jed interrupted. Wait until you've spent a week cooking for my crew. You might change your mind about how grateful you are. But there was warmth in his voice, something almost like amusement. Lark found herself smiling despite her exhaustion. I doubt that. She made her way upstairs, found the room he'd indicated. It was indeed small, just a bed, a dresser, and a chair, but it was clean and private and hers. Lark set her carpet bag on the chair and sank onto the bed, not even bothering to remove her boots. Through the floor, she could hear the sounds of the house settling, the creak of floorboards as Jed moved around downstairs, the distant lowing of cattle in the fields. the sounds of a working ranch, a living place, a home. Lark closed her eyes and felt the first tears come, hot and unexpected. They weren't tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of release, of finally letting go of all the weight she'd been carrying for so long. She'd done it. She'd walked away. She'd chosen herself. And tomorrow, she'd wake up and start building the life she'd always been meant to have. Dawn came too early and too bright, spilling through the unfamiliar window and pulling Lark from the deepest sleep she'd had in years. For a moment she lay disoriented, her mind struggling to reconcile the soft mattress beneath her with the narrow cot she'd expected. Then memory returned in a rush, the walk through darkness, Jed's quiet acceptance, the room that was hers and hers alone. She sat up quickly, wincing as her broken wrist protested the sudden movement. The sun was already well up, which meant she'd overslept. How late was it? 6? 7? The crew would be expecting breakfast and she hadn't even seen the kitchen properly, didn't know what supplies were available, didn't know what these men liked to eat or how much or... Easy now. The voice came from outside her door, followed by a gentle knock. You're not late. It's just past 5 and the men already ate. I took care of it this morning. Lark opened the door to find Jed standing in the hallway, fully dressed, looking like he'd been awake for hours, which he probably had. You cooked? Don't sound so shocked. I managed to feed myself for 35 years before you showed up. There was amusement in his voice. Get yourself together and come downstairs when you're ready. No rush. He disappeared down the hallway before she could respond, leaving Lark standing in her doorway feeling oddly bereft. She'd been prepared to start work immediately, to prove her worth, to earn her place here. Instead, he'd let her sleep and handled things himself. She dressed quickly in one of her 2 dresses, the better one, though neither was particularly fine, and did what she could with her hair, braiding it back from her face with her one good hand. The face that looked back at her from the small mirror above the dresser was thinner than she remembered, marked with the fading bruise from her father's last blow. But her eyes looked different, clearer somehow, more awake. Downstairs the kitchen was empty but showed signs of recent activity. Dishes were stacked neatly by the washing basin, the stove was still warm, and the lingering smell of coffee and bacon hung in the air. Lark moved through the space, taking proper inventory now in the morning light. It was a cook's paradise. The stove was enormous, with 6 burners and 2 ovens. The work surfaces were solid oak, worn smooth by use but well maintained. Shelves lined one entire wall, stocked with supplies that made her breath catch. Real sugar, multiple types of flour, spices she'd only read about in her mother's cookbook. There was even a cold cellar accessible through a trapdoor in the floor, and when Lark investigated, she found it stocked with preserved vegetables, hanging meat, wheels of cheese. Impressive, isn't it? She jumped, not having heard Jed return. He stood in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee, and offered her one. It's more than impressive, Lark said, accepting the cup gratefully. I've never seen a kitchen this well equipped outside of a restaurant. Had it built special 3 years ago. The woman who cooked before you, Mrs. Henderson, she had specific requirements. Said if I wanted good food, I needed to give her the tools to make it. He took a sip of his coffee. She retired last month, moved to Santa Fe to live with her daughter. Been managing without her since then, but the men are getting tired of my cooking. What are they like? The men, I mean. What are they used to eating? Jed settled against the counter, clearly comfortable in this space despite claiming no talent for it. They're ranch hands, not fancy city folk. They want food that sticks to their ribs and tastes good. Biscuits, eggs, bacon for breakfast, stew or roast for dinner, something they can eat quick and get back to work. Supper can be lighter, but they appreciate a good dessert when they can get it. How many are we feeding? 18 right now, 20 during roundup season. They eat in the bunkhouse dining hall. It's the building just east of here. Meals are at 6, noon, and 7. You cook here, then we carry everything over in covered dishes. Lark's mind was already working through possibilities, calculating quantities, planning menus. 18 men meant at least 6 dozen biscuits for breakfast, probably 10 pounds of meat for dinner, enough vegetables to feed an army. It was daunting, but it was also thrilling. This was real work, important work, the kind that mattered. Can you manage it? Jed asked, and she heard the genuine question in his voice. He wasn't doubting her. He was assessing, the way a good employer should. Yes? No hesitation. But I'll need help with the washing up and hauling. My wrist, already arranged. Miguel's youngest boy, Thomas, he'll help with dishes and heavy lifting. He's 15, strong as an ox, and his mother will be grateful for the extra income. Jed paused. Speaking of your wrist, Doc Halloway will be coming by this afternoon to look at it. I can't afford a doctor. Good thing I'm paying then. He held up a hand as she started to protest. This is a business expense, Miss McKenna. Can't have my cook working with a broken wrist that wasn't properly set. It's practical, not charity. Lark wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could manage on her own, wanted to prove she wasn't a burden or a charity case. But the truth was her wrist hurt constantly, and she could feel it wasn't healing right. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. Thank you, she said quietly. Now let's talk about today. The men already ate breakfast, so you've got time to settle in, get familiar with everything. I'll have Thomas bring in supplies from the cold cellar. You make a list of what you want. Noon meal is usually simple, sandwiches or leftover stew. Think you can handle that for your first time? I can do better than sandwiches. Jed's eyebrow rose. Can you now? Give me 2 hours and I'll prove it. Something that might have been a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. All right then. Show me what you've got, Miss McKenna. He left her to it, and Lark immediately rolled up her sleeves, metaphorically, since actually rolling them over her splinted wrist was impossible. She took proper inventory of the supplies, making notes in a small book she found in one of the drawers. Then she planned her menu, a hearty chicken and vegetable soup, fresh bread rolls, and apple turnovers using the dried apples she'd found in the cellar. Thomas arrived within the hour, a gangly teenager with his father's dark eyes and his mother's shy smile. Mr. Colt said you need help, ma'am. Miss McKenna is fine. And yes, I need several things brought up from the cold cellar. She handed him her list, watching as he read it carefully before heading down the ladder. As he worked, Lark started her bread dough, kneading it one-handed with a technique she'd perfected over the past weeks. The familiar rhythm calmed her nerves, centered her mind. This was what she knew how to do. This was where she had power. The morning passed in a blur of productive activity. The bread rose while she prepared the soup, chopping vegetables with careful precision, shredding the chicken Thomas brought up from yesterday's roasted bird. The turnovers came together quickly, simple pastry wrapped around spiced apples, sealed with a fork's tines and brushed with butter. By 11:30, the kitchen smelled like heaven. The bread had come out of the oven golden and perfect. The soup bubbled rich and fragrant on the stove, and the turnovers were just beginning to brown. Lark surveyed her work with satisfaction, then turned to Thomas. Can you help me carry this to the bunkhouse? Yes, ma'am. I mean, Miss McKenna. He grinned. The men are going to be mighty happy. They've been complaining about Mr. Colt's cooking for weeks. They loaded everything into covered dishes and made the short walk to the bunkhouse dining hall. It was a large, rough-hewn building with long tables and benches, currently empty as the men were still out working. Lark and Thomas set up the food family style, laying out stacks of bowls and plates, positioning everything so it would stay warm. The men began arriving just before noon, dusty and tired, talking among themselves about fence repairs and stubborn cattle. Their conversation died as they entered the dining hall and caught the smell of fresh bread and real cooking. Holy hell, one of them breathed. Is that actual food? Mrs. Henderson's back? Another asked hopefully. Better. Jed appeared in the doorway, and Lark realized he must have been watching for the men's arrival. This is Miss Lark McKenna, our new cook. I expect you all to treat her with respect and appreciate what she's doing for you. The men's attention turned to Lark, and she felt suddenly self-conscious, aware of her plain dress and wrapped wrist and the fact that she was probably 15 years younger than most of them. But she lifted her chin and met their gazes steadily. There's plenty for everyone, she said. Help yourselves. They needed no further encouragement. Within minutes, the room filled with the sounds of eating and appreciation, the kind of genuine pleasure that came from men who'd been subsisting on burnt beans and overcooked meat, suddenly encountering real cooking. This bread is incredible, one of them said through a mouthful. The soup's even better, another countered. When's the last time we had vegetables that weren't mush? Save room for dessert, Thomas announced proudly, bringing out the platter of apple turnovers. The response was immediate and gratifying. Grown men nearly came to blows over who got the last turnover, settling the dispute with a quick game of cards. Through it all, Lark stood near the kitchen doorway, watching their enjoyment with a satisfaction that went bone deep. This was why she cooked. Not because she had to, not because it was expected, but because food was a gift, a form of care, a way of saying, "You matter," without words. These men worked hard, and they deserved to be fed well. And she could do that. She was good at it. "I think you've won them over," Jed said quietly, appearing at her elbow. "They're easy to please. They were hungry." "No." His voice was firm. "Don't diminish what you did. That was exceptional cooking, and they know it. You know it too." Lark felt heat rise in her cheeks and changed the subject. "What do they usually do after the meal?" "Back to work. We're repairing the north fence line this week. They'll eat quick and head out again." He paused. "You did good, Miss McKenna. Real good." Before she could respond, a commotion at the door drew their attention. Two men had entered, but these weren't ranch hands. One was older, carrying a black medical bag that marked him as the doctor. The other was... Lark's breath caught. The other was her father. Gideon McKenna stood in the doorway of the bunkhouse dining hall, his face flushed with exertion and anger, his eyes wild. He'd been drinking. She could tell from the way he swayed slightly, from the aggressive set of his shoulders. "There she is!" He pointed at Lark with a shaking finger. "There's my daughter, the ungrateful little thief who ran off in the night like a common whore." The room went silent. Every man stopped eating, stopped talking, stopped moving. Lark felt her heart begin to hammer, old fear rising like bile in her throat. This was what she'd been afraid of, what she'd known would happen eventually. He'd come for her. But before she could move, before she could even think about retreating, Jed stepped between her and her father, his body a solid wall of protection. "Mr. McKenna," his voice was calm, deadly calm. "You're on my property without invitation. I suggest you leave." "Your property? Your property!" Gideon's voice rose to a roar. "That's my daughter, mine. You can't buy her like you bought my land." "I didn't buy anyone. Miss McKenna came here of her own free will to take a job I offered. She's a grown woman, making her own choices." "She's my daughter and she belongs at home." Gideon tried to push past Jed, but the younger man didn't budge. Behind him, Lark saw several of the ranch hands stand up, ready to intervene if needed. The doctor, Holloway, Lark remembered, placed a restraining hand on Gideon's arm. "Gideon, this isn't the way. Let's talk about this rationally." "Rationally? He stole everything from me. My land, my house, my daughter." Gideon's eyes found Lark's over Jed's shoulder. "You ungrateful bitch. After everything I did for you, everything I sacrificed. Everything you did to her, you mean?" Jed's voice cut through Gideon's rant like a knife. "Like breaking her wrist? Like beating her for having the audacity to speak? Like making her cook with broken bones while you drank away what little money you had left? That's lies. She fell. Did she also fall onto your fist and get that bruise on her face?" Jed's voice was getting quieter, more dangerous. "Did she fall into the fear I saw in her eyes every time you raised your voice? You don't know nothing about my family, about what it takes to raise a daughter alone after her mother died. I know you failed." The words landed like a physical blow. "I know you took a good woman's daughter and tried to break her spirit. I know you succeeded for a long time, but you don't get to do it anymore." Gideon's face had gone purple. "She's coming home with me, right now, or you'll what?" Jed's hand moved to rest on his hip, near his gun. He wasn't drawing, wasn't even touching the weapon, but the implication was clear. "You'll leave this bunkhouse. You'll get off my property, and you'll leave Miss McKenna alone. Those are your choices, Mr. McKenna. Pick one." For a long, terrible moment, Lark thought her father might actually try to fight. His hands were clenched into fists, his whole body vibrating with rage. But even drunk, even furious, Gideon wasn't quite stupid enough to challenge an armed man surrounded by his own employees. "This isn't over," he spat. "She's still my daughter. I have rights." "She's 23 years old," Doc Holloway interjected quietly. "In the eyes of the law, you have no claim on her whatsoever. She can go where she pleases." "Then she's choosing to be a whore. Working for him, living in his house. Everyone knows what that means." The words hit Lark like a slap. shame and anger mixing in equal measure. But before she could respond, Jed moved. He didn't hit Gideon, didn't even touch him. He simply stepped forward, using his superior size and the force of his presence to back the older man toward the door. "Get out, now, before I forget I'm trying to be civilized about this." Doc Holloway grabbed Gideon's arm and pulled him toward the exit. "Come on, Gideon, you've said enough, let's go." "This isn't over," Gideon shouted as he was dragged outside. "You hear me? This isn't over. She's my daughter." His voice faded as the doctor managed to get him outside, the door swinging shut behind them. The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive. Lark realized she was shaking, her good hand clutched so tightly against her chest that her fingernails were digging into her palm. "Everyone back to work," Jed said calmly, as if nothing unusual had just occurred. "Fence line won't repair itself." The men filed out quietly, though more than one paused to nod respectfully at Lark, or murmur words of support. When they were gone, only Jed, Lark, and Thomas remained. "Thomas, can you start on the dishes?" Jed asked. "Miss McKenna and I need to talk." "Yes, sir." The boy gathered plates and disappeared into the kitchen area, leaving them alone. Jed turned to Lark, and she saw concern in his eyes, not pity. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." The words came automatically, the lies she'd been telling for years. "No, you're not. And that's okay." He guided her to sit on one of the benches, then sat across from her. "Listen to me. What he said about you being here, about what people might think. He's right, though, isn't he?" Lark's voice was small. "People will talk. They'll assume things. Let them talk. People who matter will see the truth. You're here to work, nothing more. Anyone suggests otherwise, they'll answer to me." He leaned forward. "But I need to know, are you going to be able to handle this? Him showing up, making scenes, trying to drag you back? Because it might happen again." Lark took a shaky breath, forcing herself to really think about the question. Could she handle it? Could she stand firm in the face of her father's anger, the town's judgment, the constant pressure to return to her proper place? "I don't know," she admitted finally, "but I know I can't go back. Whatever happens, whatever he does, I can't go back to that house, to that life. I'd rather die." "It won't come to that," Jed's voice was firm. "But we need to be smart about this. Doc Holloway's here to check your wrist. Let him. Get it properly documented that you were injured, how bad it is. That's evidence, if we need it." "Evidence for what?" "For proving you had good reason to leave. Look, your father's not wrong that people will judge a young woman living on a ranch with a bunch of men. We need to make sure anyone who asks understands that you're here as an employee, that you're being treated properly, that this is a legitimate business arrangement." "How do we do that?" "For starters, I'm moving to the foreman's quarters behind the barn. You'll have the main house to yourself at night. No one can accuse anything improper if we're not even sleeping in the same building." "You don't have to do that. This is your house." "It's a house," Jed corrected. "I've got several buildings I could sleep in. This way protects both of us. Your reputation matters, Miss McKenna, whether you think it does or not. In a place like Rattlesnake Hollow, reputation is currency." He was right, and Lark knew it. But the fact that he was willing to move out of his own house, to inconvenience himself to protect her reputation, made her throat tighten with emotion. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. "Why go to all this trouble for someone you barely know?" Jed was quiet for a long moment, his gaze steady on hers. When he spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "My mother left my father when I was 12 years old, packed us up in the middle of the night and ran. He was a violent drunk, and she knew if she stayed, one day he'd kill her, maybe kill us too." Lark's breath caught. "I didn't know. Not many people do. We went to live with her sister in Missouri, started over with nothing. My mother worked herself nearly to death to keep us fed and clothed, but she was free, and watching her become herself again, watching her remember how to smile." He broke off, something raw crossing his face. "I swore that if I ever had the chance to help another woman get free like my mother did, I'd do it. No questions asked." The confession hung between them, intimate and painful. Lark understood now why he'd noticed her broken wrist so quickly, why he'd seen through the lies about falling into woodpiles. He'd lived this story before, from the other side. "Thank you," she said, and this time she meant it fully, completely. For seeing me, for helping me, for... Her voice broke. For caring. Don't thank me yet. This is just the beginning. Your father's going to make trouble, and people in town are going to talk, and there are going to be days when you wonder if you made the right choice. He met her eyes. But I promise you this, as long as you want to stay here, as long as you're willing to work, you'll have a place at Silver Creek. That's my word, and I don't break my word. Before Lark could respond, Doc Halloway returned, looking tired and frustrated. Got him calmed down and sent home. Prudence met us on the road. She'll keep him contained for now. He turned to Lark. Now, let's take a look at that wrist, young lady. The examination was painful and thorough. Doc Halloway unwrapped Lark's crude splint, probed the swollen wrist with gentle fingers, moved it carefully through limited ranges of motion. His face grew more grave with each passing moment. How long ago did this happen? He asked. 3 weeks, maybe 4. And you've been working on it this whole time? Lark nodded, not trusting her voice. Doc Halloway sat back with a heavy sigh. The bone's healing wrong. It's already started to set in the wrong position. I can feel where it's knitting together, but it's offset. There's going to be permanent weakness if we don't fix it. Can you fix it? Jed asked. Maybe. I'd need to re-break it, set it properly. It'll hurt like hell, and there's no guarantee it'll heal right, even then. But it's her best shot at getting full function back. Lark felt sick. Re-break it? The idea of deliberately inflicting that pain again made her want to run. But the alternative, living with a permanently damaged wrist, losing mobility, perhaps losing her ability to cook professionally, was worse. Do it, she said. Whatever you need to do, do it. Doc Halloway looked at Jed. You got any whiskey? She's going to need it. I don't drink, Lark said quickly. Today you do. The doctor's voice was kind but firm. Trust me, girl. You'll want to be at least partially numbed for this. 20 minutes later, Lark sat at the kitchen table with 2 shots of whiskey burning in her stomach and Doc Halloway's hands positioned on her wrist. Jed stood beside her, and she'd grabbed his hand without thinking, needing something to hold on to. Ready? The doctor asked. Doctor? She wasn't. Could never be ready for this. But she nodded anyway, squeezing Jed's hand so hard she felt his bones shift. The crack was audible. Pain exploded up her arm, white-hot and consuming. Lark screamed, a sound she didn't recognize as coming from herself. The world grayed at the edges, nausea rising in waves. Jed's hand was solid in hers, the only anchor keeping her from floating away into unconsciousness. Good girl, Doc Halloway murmured, working quickly now. Worst part's over, just need to set it now. More pain, but different, sharper, more focused. The grinding sensation of bone moving against bone made Lark's stomach heave, but she clamped her jaw shut and wrote it out. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the doctor stepped back. There. That's as good as I can get it. He began wrapping her wrist in proper bandages, creating a splint that was far more professional than her own attempt. You'll need to keep this immobilized for at least 6 weeks. No heavy lifting, no kneading bread, nothing that stresses the wrist. Understand? Lark nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The pain was already subsiding from agony to merely awful, helped by the whiskey and the profound relief that it was over. Can she still cook? Jed asked. Light work, maybe. Stirring pots, chopping vegetables, but nothing that requires 2 hands or significant strength. Doc Halloway closed his medical bag. That boy, Thomas? He'll need to do most of the heavy work. He will. Jed's voice was firm. Whatever she needs. The doctor left shortly after, extracting a promise from Lark to rest for the remainder of the day. Jed walked him out, and Lark heard their voices in low conversation outside. Then Jed returned alone, finding her still sitting at the table, cradling her newly splinted wrist. Thomas will handle dinner tonight, he said. I'll supervise. You're going to rest. You can rest. That's an order from your employer. But his voice was gentle. You've done more than enough for today. You proved yourself with that lunch. Nobody's questioning whether you belong here anymore. Lark wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could keep working, wanted to prove she wasn't weak or broken. But the truth was she felt hollowed out, exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. The confrontation with her father, the pain of having her wrist rebroken, the accumulated stress of the past 24 hours, it all crashed over her at once. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." Jed helped her upstairs, his hand steady on her elbow. At the door to her room, he paused. "You did good today, Miss McKenna. Better than good. You should be proud." Then he was gone, his footsteps fading down the hallway, leaving Lark alone with her thoughts and her throbbing wrist and the strange, fragile feeling of being cared for. She lay down on the bed fully clothed and stared at the ceiling. Her father had called her a whore, had accused her of the worst things he could imagine, tried to shame her into returning. And for a moment, in that bunkhouse, she'd felt the old fear, the old certainty that he was right, that she was wrong to want more than what he offered. But then Jed had stepped between them, had made it clear without words that no one would be allowed to hurt her here, to diminish her, to make her small again. And his ranch hands, men who didn't know her, who had no reason to care, had stood up too, ready to defend her. Maybe that was what freedom felt like. Not the absence of fear, but the presence of people who wouldn't let you face that fear alone. Lark closed her eyes and let exhaustion take her, falling into sleep with one hand still pressed against her newly splinted wrist, protecting the broken thing that might, with time and care, finally heal properly. When she woke, it was dark outside and someone had covered her with a quilt. On the bedside table sat a tray with cold chicken, bread, and a glass of milk. A note in Jed's handwriting read simply, "Eat. Tomorrow's a new day." Lark sat up slowly, her wrist aching but manageable. She ate the food mechanically, hardly tasting it, her mind already turning to tomorrow. To the meals she'd prepare, the men she'd feed, the life she was building here one day at a time. Her father would come back. She knew that with certainty. He wouldn't give up easily, wouldn't accept that he'd lost control of her. There would be more confrontations, more attempts to drag her back, more accusations and shame. But she also knew something else now, something that burned bright and certain in her chest. She wouldn't go back. No matter what he said, no matter what anyone said, she would never again make herself small and silent and scared to please a man who didn't deserve her submission. She was Lark McKenna, and she was finally free. And if that freedom came with a price, reputation, safety, certainty, then she'd pay it gladly. Because anything was better than the slow death of living in her father's house, cooking in that dim kitchen, accepting violence as the natural order of things. Tomorrow she'd wake early and start again. She'd cook breakfast with Thomas's help, would learn to work around her damaged wrist, would prove to Jed and his men and herself that she belonged here, that she could build a life from nothing but determination and skill. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing worth having ever was. But it would be hers. And that made all the difference. The weeks that followed took on a rhythm that was both foreign and deeply satisfying. Lark woke before dawn each morning, her internal clock adjusting quickly to ranch life. By the time the first gray light touched the horizon, she'd have coffee brewing and the kitchen warm, ready to begin the day's work. Thomas would arrive by 5:30, yawning but eager, and together they'd prepare breakfast for 18 hungry men. It was harder than cooking for just her father and Prudence, but it was also infinitely more rewarding. The ranch hands appreciated good food with an honesty that bordered on reverence. They thanked her after every meal, complimented specific dishes, asked if she could make certain things again. Their gratitude was genuine and unstinting, and it filled a hollow place in Lark's chest that she hadn't even known existed. But the real transformation wasn't in her circumstances, it was in herself. Working with her properly splinted wrist forced her to be creative, to delegate, to trust Thomas with tasks she would have insisted on doing alone before. The boy proved to be a quick learner and tireless worker, kneading dough with the enthusiasm of youth, hauling water and supplies without complaint, washing mountains of dishes with methodical efficiency. "You're getting good at this," Lark told him one morning as he shaped biscuits with surprising dexterity. "Your mother teach you to cook?" Thomas grinned, his face flushing with pleasure. "No, ma'am. She always said the kitchen was women's work, but I like it. There's something, I don't know, satisfying about making something people enjoy." "There is," Lark agreed, understanding exactly what he meant. "You've got talent, Thomas, real talent, if you wanted to pursue this professionally. My pa wants me to be a ranch hand like him, says cooking's not proper work for a man." The boy's enthusiasm dimmed slightly. But maybe someday when I'm older and can make my own choices? Lark heard the echo of her own trapped younger self in his words and made a silent vow to encourage him whenever possible. Everyone deserved the chance to pursue what they were good at, what brought them joy. She'd been denied that for too long to wish it on anyone else. By the third week, Lark's cooking had become legendary not just on the ranch but throughout Rattlesnake Hollow. Ranch hands from neighboring spreads would make excuses to visit Silver Creek around mealtimes, hoping for an invitation to stay. Mrs. Chen reported that people in town were talking about that McKenna girl's cooking with a mixture of admiration and confusion. How could someone raised by Gideon produce such remarkable food? The attention made Lark uncomfortable at first, but Jed seemed pleased by it. Good cooking attracts good workers, he explained one evening as they reviewed the week's supply needs. I've had 3 men apply for positions in the last week alone, all of them mentioning they'd heard about the food here. They'd fallen into an easy working relationship, he and Lark. Every Sunday, her day off, they'd meet in the kitchen to plan the coming week's menus and discuss supply orders. Jed had moved to the foreman's quarters as promised, but he was still involved in the daily operations of the household, still checking in to make sure Lark had what she needed. Speaking of which, Jed continued, pulling out a small ledger, I've been thinking about your wages. Lark's stomach tightened. Was he going to reduce her pay? Had she done something wrong? $3 a week isn't enough for what you're doing, he said, and Lark's breath caught. I'm raising it to $5, effective immediately. You're working harder than I expected, producing better results than I hoped for, and you deserve to be compensated fairly. That's very generous. Lark's voice came out smaller than she intended. $5 a week was more than most ranch cooks made, more than she'd ever dreamed of earning. It's fair, Jed corrected. There's a difference. He closed the ledger and looked at her directly. How's the wrist healing? Lark flexed her fingers carefully, testing the range of motion. Better. Doc Halloway says another 3 weeks in the splint, then we'll see. It still aches, especially when the weather changes, but it's manageable. Good. He was quiet for a moment, then added, Your father came by the property line yesterday. The words hit Lark like a physical blow. What? He didn't cross onto ranch land, he's not that stupid, but he sat on his horse on the far side of the fence for near an hour, just watching the house. Miguel saw him first and came to get me. I rode out to tell him to move along. What did he say? Nothing pleasant, mostly cursed me for ruining his life and stealing his daughter. Said he'd find a way to make this right, whatever that means. Jed's expression was carefully neutral. I'm telling you this not to scare you, but because you have a right to know. He hasn't given up. Lark wrapped her good arm around herself, suddenly cold despite the warm kitchen. I knew he wouldn't. My father doesn't let go of things easily, especially not when he feels he's been wronged. The question is, what's he planning? Men like him don't just watch and wait unless they're scheming something. I don't know, but whatever it is, it won't be straightforward. He'll come at it sideways, find some angle that makes him look like the victim. Lark met Jed's eyes. You should be careful. He might try to hurt you to get at me. Let him try. There was no bravado in Jed's voice, just simple statement of fact. I've dealt with worse than Gideon McKenna, but I appreciate the warning. They finished their planning in companionable silence, and afterward, Lark spent the rest of her Sunday afternoon in the kitchen, despite it being her day off. She couldn't help herself. There was a new recipe she wanted to try, a spice cake her mother used to make that required careful attention and precise timing. Working with one hand made it challenging, but she was learning to adapt, to find new ways of doing familiar tasks. She was just pulling the cake from the oven when she heard voices outside, raised, angry voices. Lark set down the hot pan and moved to the window, her heart beginning to race. In the yard, Jed stood facing 3 men on horseback. Even from a distance, Lark recognized the lead rider, Sheriff Coleman, a heavy-set man who'd been more interested in collecting bribes than enforcing justice for as long as Lark could remember. The 2 men flanking him looked like deputies, though their badges seemed newly minted. Lark couldn't hear what they were saying, but she saw Jed's posture shift, saw him cross his arms in a gesture that suggested he wasn't pleased with whatever the sheriff was telling him. The conversation went on for several minutes, the sheriff gesturing emphatically while Jed remained still as stone. Finally, Jed nodded once and turned toward the house. The sheriff and his deputies didn't leave, just sat on their horses waiting. Lark moved away from the window, suddenly afraid. This was it. Whatever her father had planned, it was happening now. Jed entered through the kitchen door, his expression carefully controlled. "Miss McKenna, Sheriff Coleman would like a word with you." "About what?" "He didn't say specifically, but he's got a warrant." Jed's voice was tight with suppressed anger. "I tried to tell him this was unnecessary, that you'd cooperate voluntarily, but he insisted on doing it official-like." A warrant? For what?" Lark's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. "I haven't done anything wrong." "I know that, you know that. But your father's filed a complaint saying you stole from him before you left. Says you took your mother's jewelry, some cash, and other valuables." The accusation was so absurd that Lark almost laughed. "My mother's jewelry?" "She was buried wearing the only good piece she owned, her wedding ring. And we never had cash in that house. You know that as well as anyone. He drank away every penny. That's what I told Coleman. But he says he has to investigate the complaint regardless. It's all legal and proper, or at least dressed up to look that way." Jed moved closer, lowering his voice. "Whatever happens, stay calm. Answer their questions honestly. They've got nothing on you because there's nothing to find. This is just your father making trouble." Lark nodded, trying to steady her breathing. She wiped her hands on her apron and followed Jed outside, where Sheriff Coleman had dismounted and was waiting with an expression of bureaucratic impatience. "Miss McKenna," he said, not quite meeting her eyes, "I'm going to need to ask you some questions about the night you left your father's house." "All right." Lark kept her voice level, refusing to show fear. "Your father claims you stole items of value before you departed. Specifically, he mentions a gold locket, a pearl necklace, approximately $50 in cash, and several items of clothing belonging to his wife, Mrs. Prudence McKenna." Each accusation was more ludicrous than the last. "Sheriff, I took nothing that didn't belong to me. The clothes I'm wearing are mine. I have 2 dresses, both of which I made myself. I took no jewelry because there was no jewelry to take, and there was certainly no cash." "Your father says differently." "My father is a liar and a drunk who's angry that I left." The words came out sharper than Lark intended, but she was tired of being patient, tired of pretending Gideon McKenna deserved any consideration. "He's making false accusations because he wants to punish me for choosing to work rather than stay and be his servant." Sheriff Coleman's eyes narrowed. "That's a serious accusation against your own father." "Is it an accusation if it's true?" Lark shot back. "Ask anyone in Rattlesnake Hollow about Gideon McKenna's drinking. Ask Doc Halloway about how I got a broken wrist from falling into a woodpile. Ask Mrs. Chen about the supplies she delivered here. Supplies Mr. Colt paid for because my father couldn't afford to feed his own household properly." "Miss McKenna," Jed said quietly, "a warning." But Lark was past caution now, past politeness. She was angry, deeply, righteously angry at being forced to defend herself against lies, at having her father use the law as a weapon against her. "You want to search my room?" she demanded. "Search it. You won't find anything because there's nothing to find. My father is using you to harass me, Sheriff, and you're letting him do it because it's easier than telling a white man he's wrong." Coleman's face reddened. "I'm just doing my job." "Your job is to uphold the law, not to help abusive fathers terrorize their daughters." Lark's voice rang clear across the yard, and she saw ranch hands emerging from the bunkhouse, drawn by the commotion. "But if you need to search my room to satisfy my father's lies, then do it. I have nothing to hide." The sheriff glanced at Jed, who gave a single sharp nod. "Go ahead, Coleman, but I'm accompanying you, and so is Miss McKenna. Everything stays official and proper." They went upstairs, the sheriff huffing with exertion, his deputies trailing behind. Lark's room looked exactly as she'd left it that morning, bed made, few possessions neatly arranged on the dresser. Her carpetbag sat in the corner, still mostly empty. Sheriff Coleman made a show of looking through the drawers, checking under the bed, even examining the contents of her carpetbag. He found exactly what Lark knew he'd find: 2 plain dresses, a spare pair of stockings, her mother's cookbook, and the broken pieces of her mother's wedding china carefully wrapped in cloth. "What's this?" He held up the china fragments. "My mother's dishes," Lark said quietly. My father broke them in a rage 4 years ago. I kept the pieces because they were hers. Coleman set them down carefully, something that might have been sympathy flickering across his face. He continued his search, but it was clear his heart wasn't in it anymore. There was no gold locket, no pearl necklace, no mysterious $50, just the sparse belongings of a young woman who'd left home with almost nothing. Satisfied? Jed asked when the search was complete. I'm going to need to file a report, Coleman said, not answering directly. But it appears Miss McKenna is telling the truth. There's no evidence of theft. Because there was no theft, Lark said. Just a father angry that he's lost control of his daughter. The sheriff and his deputies left shortly after, though Coleman pulled Jed aside for a private conversation before mounting his horse. Lark watched from the kitchen window, her heart still racing, hands trembling with delayed reaction. When Jed returned, he found her sitting at the kitchen table staring at nothing. He apologized, Jed said without preamble, said he had to follow up on the complaint but that he'd suspected it was false from the beginning. He's going to tell your father that the investigation found nothing and the matter is closed. It won't be closed, Lark said dully. Not for him. He'll find another way to come at me. Maybe, but each time he tries and fails, he looks more desperate, more unreasonable. People are starting to see him for what he is. Jed pulled out a chair and sat across from her. Mrs. Chen came by yesterday with gossip from town. Seems your father's been drinking more than usual, running up tabs he can't pay, getting into arguments with anyone who'll listen. Prudence left him 3 days ago. Lark's head snapped up. What? Went to stay with her cousin in Tucson. Took what she could carry and left in the night, just like you did. Word is she couldn't take it anymore. The drinking, the violence, the poverty. Your father's alone now in that house on the Dawson Ranch, working as a hired hand and hating every minute of it. Lark tried to feel sympathy and found she couldn't. Good. Maybe he'll finally understand what it feels like to be powerless. Maybe. Jed was quiet for a moment, then added, The men want to know if there's going to be cake. They smelled it baking and got their hopes up. The abrupt change of subject made Lark blink, then laugh, a slightly hysterical sound that she couldn't quite control. The cake. I forgot about the cake. It's still sitting on the counter, looking perfect. Jed's voice was gentle. Come on. Let's serve it up and remind ourselves that not everything in life is drama and struggle. Sometimes there's just good cake and people who appreciate it. They cut the cake together, Lark directing while Jed wielded the knife. When the ranch hands filed in for their Sunday evening dessert, a special treat Lark had instituted, their genuine delight at the spice cake did exactly what Jed had intended. It reminded her why she was here, what she was building, what mattered. Miss McKenna, one of the older hands said, his weathered face creasing with pleasure. This might be the best thing I've ever tasted. Better than your wife's cooking, Frank? Another man teased. Don't have a wife no more, and this is exactly why, Frank shot back, but he was grinning. A man could get used to eating like this. The easy camaraderie, the simple pleasure of shared food, the normalcy of it all, it grounded Lark in a way that nothing else could. This was real. This mattered. Her father's desperate attempts to control her, the sheriff's intrusive search, the town's gossip. None of it could touch this moment of connection and satisfaction. Later, after the men had left and Thomas had finished the washing up, Lark sat alone in the kitchen with a cup of tea and her mother's cookbook. She turned to the page with the spice cake recipe and read her mother's notes in the margin. Made this for Marcus on our first anniversary. He said it tasted like love. Maybe all good food does. Marcus had been her father's name, back when he was someone different. Back when he'd been capable of tasting love in a simple cake, of seeing his wife's care in every meal she prepared. Lark tried to reconcile that man with the one who'd broken her wrist and filed false charges against her, and found she couldn't. They were two different people, and the second had destroyed the first so completely that nothing remained but rage and resentment. You still up? Lark looked up to find Jed standing in the doorway, his hair damp like he'd just washed up. Couldn't sleep. Too much excitement for one day. He moved to the stove and poured himself coffee from the pot that was always kept warm. Mind if I join you? It's your house. It's your kitchen, he countered, but he sat anyway, cradling his cup between his hands. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. the kind that didn't need filling with words. Finally, Jed spoke. I want you to know something. What your father's doing, the harassment, the false accusations, the attempts to intimidate you, it's not going to work. Not because I'm protecting you, though I am, but because you're stronger than he ever gave you credit for. You proved that today. I didn't feel strong. I felt angry. Anger is a kind of strength when it's righteous, when it pushes you to stand up for yourself instead of accepting injustice. He took a sip of coffee. My mother was angry the night she left my father, angry enough to risk everything, our safety, our security, our reputation. And that anger kept her moving forward when fear might have made her turn back. Did she ever regret it, leaving? Not once. Even when things were hardest, even when we were eating nothing but beans and bread for weeks at a time, she never regretted choosing freedom over security. Jed met Lark's eyes. That's what you chose too, you know, and it's going to get harder before it gets easier. Your father's not done fighting, and there will be more attempts to undermine you, to make you doubt yourself. I know. Lark wrapped her hands around her teacup, drawing warmth from the ceramic. But I also know I can't go back. Whatever happens, I can't go back. You won't have to. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Jed's voice was firm with conviction. You've got a place here for as long as you want it. You've earned that through your work, through your skill, through your determination. Whatever your father tries, it can't change that. The words settled over Lark like a blanket, warm and reassuring. For the first time since the sheriff had arrived, she felt her tension begin to ease, her racing heart slow to something approaching normal. Thank you, she said quietly, for everything. For standing with me today, for believing me, for... She broke off, not sure how to articulate what his steady support meant to her. You don't need to thank me. Just keep making cake this good, and we'll call it even. The words were light, teasing, but his eyes were serious. Get some rest, Miss McKenna. Tomorrow's Monday, and the men will be expecting their usual excellent breakfast. He left her alone in the kitchen, and Lark sat for a while longer, watching the fire burn low, thinking about strength and anger and the strange new life she was building from the ashes of her old one. The next morning dawned gray and threatening, with clouds massing on the horizon and the smell of rain in the air. Lark woke before her usual time, her sleep having been restless and interrupted by dreams she couldn't quite remember. She dressed quickly and went downstairs to find Thomas already in the kitchen, stoking the fire. Morning, Miss McKenna, he said cheerfully. Figured I'd get an early start. Big storm coming? Mr. Colt wants to make sure the men get a good breakfast before they have to work in the rain. They worked together in comfortable rhythm, preparing biscuits and gravy, frying eggs and bacon, setting out preserves and butter. The ranch hands arrived in groups, stamping mud from their boots, talking about fence repairs and cattle that needed moving before the storm hit. Jed came last, looking tired like he'd been up early dealing with preparations. He accepted a plate of food with a nod of thanks and ate quickly, his mind clearly elsewhere. When the meal was finished and the men had headed out to their work, he lingered in the kitchen. I need to ride into town today, he said. Business at the bank, some supplies to order. I'll probably be gone most of the day. Something in his tone made Lark look up. Is everything all right? Fine. Just want to make sure certain things are handled properly. He hesitated, then added, If anyone comes by while I'm gone, your father, the sheriff, anyone, you send them away and tell them to come back when I'm here. Don't let anyone pressure you into anything. I won't. But Lark felt uneasy. What aren't you telling me? Jed studied her for a moment, clearly debating how much to share. Finally, he said, I'm going to the bank to make sure your father can't claim any financial interest in your wages. I want everything documented properly, that you're an employee, that your pay goes directly to you, that you have your own account separate from any family claims. Can he do that? Claim my wages? Legally? No, not in most cases, but your father's proven he's willing to twist the law to serve his purposes. I want to make sure there's no ambiguity, no loopholes he can exploit. Jed's expression was grim. After yesterday's stunt with the sheriff, I'm not taking any chances. The care he was taking to protect her, the thoroughness of his planning, made Lark's throat tighten. You really don't have to do all this. Yes, I do. His voice was firm. Because if something happened to you because I failed to plan properly, I'd never forgive myself. So let me do this, all right? Let me make sure you're protected in every way I can think of. He left shortly after, riding toward town under increasingly dark skies. Lark watched him go with a mixture of gratitude and worry. She'd brought trouble to his door, complicated his life, made him a target of her father's rage, and yet he kept standing by her, kept finding new ways to ensure her safety. The morning passed quietly. Lark prepared a cold lunch for the men since they'd be working through the noon meal, then started on dinner preparations. The storm broke around 2 o'clock, rain hammering against the roof with tropical intensity, thunder rolling across the plains like artillery fire. She was peeling potatoes with Thomas when she heard the sound of horses approaching. Not Jed, the rhythm was wrong, and there were too many of them. Lark moved to the window and felt her blood turn cold. Her father sat on a tired-looking horse in the driving rain, but he wasn't alone. Behind him were 4 other men, rough-looking characters she didn't recognize. They weren't dressed like ranch hands or townspeople. They looked like the kind of men who lived on the edges of civilization, who hired themselves out for jobs that decent folks wouldn't touch. "Thomas," Lark said quietly, "go get Miguel. Tell him to bring some of the men. Don't run. Don't make it obvious. Just walk casual-like to the bunkhouse and tell him we have visitors." The boy's eyes widened, but he nodded and slipped out the back door. Lark stayed at the window, watching as her father dismounted and approached the house with his hired thugs flanking him. This was it then. Whatever he'd been planning, he was making his move while Jed was away. The knock on the door was loud and aggressive. Lark took a deep breath, straightened her spine, and went to answer it. She didn't open the door fully, just stood in the gap with her hand on the frame, blocking entry. "Father?" Lark. His voice was surprisingly sober, which somehow made it more frightening. "I've come to take you home. This is my home now. I work here. I'm not going anywhere with you." "See, that's where you're wrong." Gideon's smile was cold and triumphant. "I've been doing some research, talking to some lawyers. Turns out there's laws about women working in houses with unmarried men, about the kind of living arrangements that constitute immoral behavior." Lark's stomach dropped. "I'm employed here as a cook. There's nothing immoral about that. That's for a judge to decide, ain't it? And I'm prepared to file a complaint with the territorial court, claiming that you're living in circumstances harmful to your moral welfare. As your father, I have a legal right to remove you from such circumstances." His smile widened. "I've got witnesses willing to testify that they've seen you and Colt together at all hours, that you live in his house, that the arrangement ain't proper." "Those would be lies." "Would they? Can you prove it? Can you prove nothing improper has happened?" Gideon leaned closer. "I thought not. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to come with me, quiet-like, and we're going to go back to Rattlesnake Hollow. You'll apologize for your behavior, and we'll figure out a proper arrangement for you. Maybe marriage to a decent man who can control you." "I'm not going anywhere with you." But Lark's voice shook despite her best efforts. Could he really do this? Could he use the law to force her back? "Then I'll have the sheriff remove you forcibly, and I'll make sure everyone in the territory knows that Jed Colt was running an immoral house, corrupting young women. That'll be real good for his business, won't it?" It was blackmail, pure and simple. Cooperate or he'd destroy Jed's reputation, ruin everything he'd built. And the worst part was, it might work. People were quick to believe the worst, especially about a wealthy man and a young woman living under the same roof. "You've got 1 minute to decide," Gideon said. "Come with me now, or I ride straight to the sheriff and file my complaint. Your choice." Lark's mind raced, searching for options, for escape routes, for anything. But she was trapped, cornered by her father's vindictiveness and the territory's narrow moral codes. If she refused, he'd make good on his threat. Jed would be dragged through the mud, his reputation destroyed, his business damaged, all because he'd tried to help her. But if she went with her father, everything she'd fought for would be lost. She'd be right back where she started, trapped and powerless and broken. 30 seconds, Gideon said. Then through the rain, Lark heard the thunder of approaching horses, many horses, moving fast. She looked past her father and saw Jed riding hell-bent toward the house, flanked by Sheriff Coleman and 2 other men she recognized as town officials. Behind them came Miguel and half the ranch hands, all armed and grim-faced. Jed dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, striding toward Gideon with fury etched into every line of his body. "Get off my property, McKenna, now! I'm here for my daughter. You're here to perpetrate fraud and extortion, and you're doing it in front of a law officer." Jed gestured to Sheriff Coleman, who was dismounting more slowly. "Sheriff, this man is attempting to force Miss McKenna to leave her legitimate employment through threats and false accusations. I want him removed from my property and charged accordingly." Coleman looked uncomfortable but determined. "Mr. McKenna, I'm going to have to ask you and your associates to leave. Mr. Colt's filed documentation with the territorial court showing Miss McKenna's employment here is legal and proper. He's also filed an affidavit from Dr. Holloway about the injuries she sustained while living in your house." The sheriff's voice hardened. "If you continue to harass Miss McKenna or Mr. Colt, you will be arrested. Is that clear?" Gideon's face had gone from triumphant to shocked to enraged in the space of seconds. "You can't do this! She's my daughter!" "She's an adult woman with the legal right to choose her own employment and living arrangements," said one of the men with Jed, a lawyer by the look of him. "Mr. Colt has taken extensive measures to ensure everything is above board and proper. Miss McKenna has her own room in the main house. Mr. Colt has relocated to separate quarters. She maintains her own bank account, and her employment contract has been filed with the territorial registry. There is no legal basis for your claims of impropriety. Furthermore," the lawyer continued, pulling out documents from his saddlebag despite the rain, "if you continue this harassment, we will seek a restraining order preventing you from coming within 100 yards of Miss McKenna or Silver Creek Ranch. And we will file charges for extortion, fraud, and filing false reports with law enforcement." Lark watched her father's face as the reality of the situation sank in. Jed had outmaneuvered him completely. Every angle Gideon might have exploited had been closed off, every legal loophole sealed. There was no way forward for him, no path to force her back under his control. "You'll regret this," Gideon snarled at Jed. "All of you will regret crossing me." "The only person who's going to regret anything is you if you don't leave in the next 30 seconds, Jed said quietly. "And if those men you brought with you so much as look at anyone wrong, they'll answer to me and my crew. Your choice." For a moment, Lark thought her father might actually try to fight. His hand twitched toward his hip, and she saw the hired thugs tense. But then Sheriff Coleman stepped forward, hand on his own weapon, and the moment passed. "Come on, Gideon," one of the hired men muttered. "This ain't worth it." They mounted up and rode off into the rain, Gideon twisting in his saddle for one last venomous look at his daughter. Then they were gone, swallowed by the storm, and Lark sagged against the doorframe as the tension drained out of her. Jed was at her side immediately, steadying her with a hand on her elbow. "Are you all right? Did he hurt you?" "No, I'm fine, Lark looked up at him, seeing the worry in his eyes, the barely controlled anger still simmering beneath his calm exterior. "How did you know to come back?" "Thomas found me on the road. He'd run after me when he saw your father approaching with those men." Jed's voice was rough. "I'd already been to the bank and the courthouse, had everything documented and filed. When I heard he was here, I gathered everyone I needed and came as fast as I could." "You planned this, all of it, the bank trip, the documentation, having the lawyer ready. I planned for every possibility I could think of. I told you I wouldn't let him hurt you again." His hand was still on her elbow, steadying and warm. "Are you sure you're all right?" Lark nodded, then found herself laughing, a slightly wild sound that was part relief, part hysteria, part pure joy. "He tried to blackmail me, threatened to ruin your reputation if I didn't go with him, and you shut down every avenue he had. You made it impossible for him to touch me." "That was the idea." Jed smiled slightly, though I'll admit, having him show up with hired thugs wasn't in my calculations. That was bold, even for him. "Desperate," Sheriff Coleman corrected, approaching the porch. "He's running out of options and he knows it. This was likely his last real attempt to control you, Miss McKenna. After this, if he comes near you again, I can arrest him without question." The sheriff and the other officials left shortly after, but Jed's ranch hands lingered, clearly wanting to make sure everything was truly settled. Miguel approached with Thomas in tow, the boy looking proud and excited despite the danger. "Good work, Thomas," Jed said. "Quick thinking, running to get me." Miss McKenna told me to get help first, Thomas said. I ran further than she probably meant. You did exactly right, Lark told him, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you. The men dispersed gradually until only Jed and Lark remained on the porch, watching the rain fall and the sky slowly lighten as the storm moved on. Neither of them spoke for a long time, both processing what had almost happened, what had been prevented. Finally, Jed broke the silence. He won't come back. Not after this. He knows he's lost. How can you be sure? Because I know men like him. They're bullies who only push when they think they can win. We just proved he can't win. Not against us, not against the law, not against the truth. Jed turned to look at her directly. You're safe now, Lark. Really safe. Not just protected, but legally secure. He has no claim on you, no power over you. You're free. The words sank in slowly, like rain soaking into parched earth. Free. She was free. Not just physically distant from her father's house, but legally, officially, irrevocably free. No more fear of being dragged back. No more looking over her shoulder. No more waiting for the other shoe to drop. Lark felt tears begin to stream down her face, hot and unexpected. They weren't tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of relief so profound it felt like her entire body was releasing years of accumulated tension all at once. Hey, Jed said softly, and then his arms were around her, steady and strong, offering comfort without expectation. It's all right. You're all right now. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Lark believed it was true. The embrace lasted only a moment before Lark stepped back, suddenly self-conscious. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, embarrassed by the tears, by the vulnerability she'd shown. But when she looked at Jed, there was no judgment in his expression, only understanding. I should get back to dinner preparations, she said, her voice still thick. The men will be hungry after working in the rain all day. The men can wait another hour. You've had a hell of a morning. Jed gestured toward the kitchen. Come on, I'll make you some tea and you're going to sit down for a few minutes, whether you like it or not. It was an order, gently delivered, and Lark found she didn't have the energy to argue. She followed him inside, where the kitchen was still warm from the breakfast fire, still smelling faintly of bacon and coffee. Thomas had disappeared, probably giving them privacy, she realized, and the house felt quiet and safe around them. Jed moved through this kitchen with surprising competence, setting water to boil, finding cups and tea leaves. Lark watched him, noting the careful way he measured the tea, the precision with which he poured the hot water. His hands were scarred from years of ranch work, rope burns and knife cuts, and the general wear of a life lived outdoors, but they moved with a gentleness that contradicted their rough appearance. Here. He set a cup in front of her and took the seat across the table. Drink, it'll help. Lark wrapped her hands around the cup, drawing warmth from the ceramic. They sat in silence for a while. The only sounds, the ticking of the clock on the wall and the diminishing patter of rain on the roof. The storm was passing, moving east toward the mountains, leaving clarity in its wake. Can I ask you something? Lark said finally. Anything. Why did you really pay off my father's debts? Was it just to help me, or... She trailed off, unsure how to phrase the question that had been nagging at her for weeks. Jed was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on his own cup. When he spoke, his voice was measured, careful. Honestly, both. I wanted to help you, that part's true. But I'd also had my eye on that property for a while. It borders my eastern range, has water access that would be useful. From a business standpoint, acquiring it made sense. So it was just business. No. He looked up, meeting her eyes directly. If it had been just business, I would have waited for the bank to foreclose and bought it at auction for half what I paid your father. I paid what I did, when I did, because you needed a way out, and I could provide it. The land was an added benefit, not the primary motivation. The honesty in his voice made Lark's chest tighten. And hiring me? Was that part of the business calculation too? I needed a cook. You needed work. That's how employment works. He paused, then added quietly, but if you're asking whether I would have gone to all this trouble, the documentation, the legal protections, standing up to your father, for just any employee? No, I wouldn't have. Then why? Because you reminded me of my mother. The words came out in a rush, as if he'd been holding them back for a long time. That first day I came to your father's house. When I saw you in that kitchen with your wrist broken and your eyes full of fear but still standing, still cooking, still refusing to break, you looked exactly like my mother did the night she decided to leave. And I thought, if someone had helped her earlier, if someone had given her an option before it got so bad she had to run with nothing but the clothes on her back. He broke off, shaking his head. I couldn't give my mother that chance, but I could give it to you. Lark felt tears threatening again and blinked them back. I'm not your mother. No, you're not. You're yourself, and that's enough. Jed's voice was firm. You're talented and strong and determined. You deserve a chance to build a life on your own terms, free from violence and fear. That's all I'm trying to provide. A chance. What you do with it is up to you. The conversation felt weighted with something unspoken, something that hovered in the air between them, like possibility. Lark recognized it for what it was, the beginning of something that could become more than employer and employee, protector and protected. But she also recognized that now wasn't the time to explore it, not when everything was still so raw and uncertain. Thank you, she said simply. For the chance, for everything. You're welcome. Jed stood, the moment passing. Now, I believe you mentioned dinner preparations. I'll send Thomas back in to help. And Lark? He paused at the door. Take your time. Nobody's going to complain if dinner's a little late today. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of productive activity. Lark threw herself into cooking with renewed energy, channeling all of her leftover fear and relief into creating a meal that would remind everyone that life went on, that normalcy could be reclaimed even after crisis. She made beef stew thick with vegetables, fresh bread rolls, and a dried apple cobbler that filled the kitchen with the smell of cinnamon and comfort. The men ate with their usual appreciation, but there was something different in the atmosphere that evening. Word had spread about what had happened. Thomas had told the story with all the drama of youth, making it sound even more dangerous than it had been. The ranch hands looked at Lark with a new respect, seeing her not just as the woman who fed them, but as someone who'd stood up to real danger, who'd earned her place here through courage as much as skill. That was one hell of a thing today, Frank said as he helped himself to a second serving of cobbler. Your father showing up with hired guns like that. They weren't really hired guns, Lark corrected, uncomfortable with the attention. Just men he paid to look intimidating. Well, they looked plenty intimidating to me, another hand chimed in. Took guts to stand there and face him down. I didn't have much choice. There's always a choice, Miguel said quietly. The older man rarely spoke during meals, but when he did, people listened. You could have gone with him to avoid trouble. You could have let fear win, but you stood your ground, and that takes strength. My wife, she says to tell you that if you ever need anything, anything at all, you come to our house. You're family now, Miss McKenna. That's what she says, and she's right. The simple declaration made Lark's throat tighten. Family. She'd been without real family for so long, she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be claimed by others, to be folded into a community that cared whether you lived or died, suffered or thrived. Thank you, Miguel. Tell your wife I appreciate that more than I can say. As the days turned into weeks, autumn deepened into something approaching winter. The desert nights grew cold and frost sometimes painted intricate patterns on the kitchen windows in the early morning. Lark's wrist healed slowly but steadily, and the day Doc Halloway finally removed the splint for good felt like a liberation. She flexed her fingers, marveling at the range of motion she'd regained, the strength that was returning with each passing day. It's not perfect, the doctor warned. Might always be a little weak, might ache when storms come through. But it's functional, and that's better than I hoped for when I first saw it. It's more than functional, Lark said, testing her grip. It's enough. And it was. She could knead bread again, could lift heavy pots, could work with both hands in the seamless rhythm she'd developed over years of cooking. The difference it made in her efficiency was remarkable, and she celebrated by baking 3 different kinds of pie in a single day, just because she could. Thanksgiving came and went, marked by a feast that took 3 days to prepare and left even the most hardened ranch hands groaning about how full they were. Lark cooked turkey and ham, made cornbread dressing and sweet potato casserole, baked pumpkin and pecan, and mince pies until the kitchen looked like a bakery. The men ate until they couldn't move, then somehow found room for seconds of dessert. "Miss McKenna," Jed said at the end of that long day, "I don't know how you do it, but you've ruined me for ordinary food. Everything else is going to taste bland after this." "Good," Lark said, surprising herself with the teasing tone. "That means you can't ever let me go." The words hung in the air for a moment, taking on meaning neither of them had quite intended. Jed's eyes met hers, and something electric passed between them. Recognition of feelings that had been growing quietly for months, carefully tended but never acknowledged out loud. "No," he said softly. "I don't suppose I can." Winter brought its own challenges and rhythms. The ranch work slowed somewhat, with fewer cattle to manage and more time spent on maintenance and repairs. The kitchen became the warm heart of the property, the place where people gathered not just to eat, but to seek refuge from the cold. Lark found herself cooking not just meals, but comfort, thick soups and hearty stews, fresh bread and hot coffee, desserts that reminded people of home and family and better times. Thomas had become indispensable, and Lark had started teaching him seriously, showing him not just how to cook, but why certain techniques worked, how flavors combined, what made food memorable rather than merely edible. The boy soaked up knowledge like desert sand soaking up rain, and his enthusiasm reminded Lark of her own younger self, learning at her mother's elbow. "You're a natural teacher," Jed observed one evening, watching Lark demonstrate how to properly brown meat for stew, while Thomas took careful notes. "I had a good teacher myself once." Lark's voice was soft with memory. "My mother used to say that cooking was a kind of love language, a way of caring for people when words weren't enough. I want Thomas to understand that it's not just about following recipes, it's about intent." She sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. She deserved better than what life gave her. Lark turned the meat, watching it sizzle and brown. "But she taught me everything that matters, how to find joy in simple things, how to make beauty out of ordinary ingredients, how to keep going when everything feels impossible. She'd be proud of you." The words made Lark pause, spatula in hand. Would her mother be proud? Of the way she'd left her father's house? Of the life she was building here? Of the woman she was becoming? She thought perhaps yes. Her mother had stayed because she'd believed in love, in the possibility of redemption, in the man her husband had once been. But she'd also taught Lark that survival mattered, that taking care of yourself wasn't selfishness, but necessity. "I hope so," Lark said finally. "I hope she'd understand why I had to leave." Any mother who loved you would understand that. Jed's voice was certain. "You didn't leave because you were weak or selfish. You left because staying would have killed you, either quickly or by inches. That's not running away. That's choosing life." It was the most direct he'd ever been about what she'd escaped, and Lark felt something shift in her understanding. She hadn't failed by leaving. She hadn't been disloyal or ungrateful. She'd simply refused to die for someone else's anger, and that was a kind of courage all its own. Christmas approached with surprising speed, and Lark threw herself into preparations with an enthusiasm that surprised even her. She'd never particularly enjoyed the holiday before. In her father's house, it had been just another day marked by too much drinking and simmering resentment. But here, at Silver Creek, Christmas felt like possibility. She planned elaborate menus, experimented with recipes from her mother's cookbook, enlisted Thomas's help in making decorations from pine boughs and dried oranges. "You're like a child," Jed teased, finding her in the kitchen at midnight 3 days before Christmas, still working on a complex sugar cookie recipe that required precise timing. "I'm making up for lost years," Lark said, not looking up from her piping work. "All those Christmases that were just another day to survive. I'm replacing them with better memories." "Fair enough." He watched her work for a moment, then asked, "What do you want for Christmas, Lark?" The question surprised her. She'd been so focused on what she could give, the meals she could prepare, the joy she could create for others, that she hadn't thought about what she might receive. "I don't need anything. I have everything I need." That wasn't the question. "What do you want?" Lark set down her piping bag and considered. What did she want? Safety. She had that now. Freedom. That too. Work that mattered. People who appreciated her. A place to call home. She had all of those things. But there was something else, something she'd barely let herself acknowledge even in the privacy of her own thoughts. "I want to stay," she said quietly. "Not just for now, but permanently. I want to know that this is home, not just a temporary stop on the way to somewhere else." "You already have that." Jed's voice was gentle. "Your contract has no end date. You can stay as long as you want." "That's not what I mean." Lark turned to face him fully, her heart hammering. "A contract is business. I want more than business." The words hung between them, brave and terrifying. Lark had never been bold about her feelings, had never had reason to be. But the past months had taught her that speaking up, taking risks, choosing what she wanted, these were skills she could learn, could practice, could get better at. Jed crossed the kitchen slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. When he reached her, he took her flour-dusted hands in his. "I've been trying to be respectful," he said, "trying not to take advantage of the situation, trying to keep things professional. But Lark, I stopped seeing you as just an employee about 5 minutes after you walked into this kitchen with nothing but a carpet bag and more courage than I'd seen in any 10 men. Then what do you see?" "I see a partner, someone strong enough to stand beside me, not behind me. Someone who makes this house feel like a home, instead of just a place to sleep between work." His hands tightened on hers. "I see someone I could build a life with, if she was willing." Lark's breath caught. This was more than she'd dared to hope for, more than she'd thought possible. "I'm willing," she whispered. "More than willing." He kissed her then, soft and careful, his lips warm against hers. It was nothing like the rough, demanding kisses she'd read about in novels, nothing violent or overwhelming. It was gentle and patient and full of promise, the kiss of a man who understood that tenderness could be its own kind of strength. When they pulled apart, Lark found herself smiling wider than she could remember smiling in years. "So what happens now?" "Now we take our time," Jed said. "We court properly, let people get used to the idea, do things the right way. I won't have anyone saying I took advantage of you or that this was anything other than two people choosing each other freely." "How long?" "As long as it takes. 6 months, a year, whatever feels right." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "But Lark, I want you to know that this isn't about gratitude or obligation or convenience. I care about you specifically, not just anyone who could fill this role. And I'm willing to wait as long as necessary to prove that." The declaration was everything she needed to hear. Lark leaned into him, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady thrum of his heartbeat. "I care about you too," she said, "and I'm not afraid of waiting. I've learned patience these past months." They stood like that for a while, holding each other in the quiet kitchen, the cookies forgotten on the counter. Outside, the desert night was clear and cold, stars scattered across the sky like thrown diamonds. Inside, warmth and possibility, and the beginning of something new. Christmas Day dawned bright and cold, the kind of perfect winter morning that seemed designed for celebration. Lark was up before dawn as always, but this time it felt different. Not work, but joy. Not obligation, but gift. She prepared a feast that would have made her mother proud. Roasted goose and ham, mashed potatoes and gravy, green beans with bacon, fresh rolls, 3 kinds of pie, and a spice cake that drew compliments before anyone had even tasted it. The ranch hands gathered in the main house, a special concession for the holiday, and the dining room filled with laughter and conversation and the comfortable chaos of people who'd become family over shared meals and hard work. Miguel's wife Rosa came with their children, and Thomas brought his whole family, and before long the house was full of life in a way it never had been before. Jed caught Lark's eye across the crowded room and smiled, and she felt her heart expand with something that felt dangerously close to perfect happiness. This was what she'd been searching for without knowing it, not just safety or freedom or work, but belonging. Community. Home. After the meal, as people lingered over coffee and dessert, Frank stood up and cleared his throat. "I'm not much for speeches," he said gruffly, "but I wanted to say something. A lot of us here, we've worked a lot of ranches, eaten a lot of food. But this year, with Miss McKenna cooking for us, has been different, better. Not just because the food's good, though it is, but because she makes it with care. You can taste that in every bite. So I wanted to say thank you, Miss McKenna, for making Silver Creek feel like home." A chorus of agreement rose from the assembled group, and Lark felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you," she managed. "All of you. This has been the best year of my life, and that's because of the people in this room. You've given me more than a job. You've given me a place to belong. I'm grateful for that every single day." Later, after everyone had left and the kitchen was clean and the house was quiet again, Lark found herself standing on the front porch, looking out at the darkened landscape. The land that had once belonged to her father was visible in the distance, a dark shape against the starlit sky. But it held no power over her now, no fear or regret. It was just land, and she was free of it. Thinking about something specific? Jed joined her, draping a blanket over her shoulders against the cold. "Just thinking about how much has changed. A year ago, I was trapped in that house, broken and afraid, and seeing no way forward. And now," she gestured at the ranch, the house behind them, the vast possibility of the world beyond. "Now I have everything I never dared to hope for." "You earned it, every bit of it." Jed put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him. "And Lark? This is just the beginning. We've got years ahead of us, years to build something together. That's my promise to you, time and partnership, and all the ordinary happiness we can create." "That sounds perfect," Lark said. And she meant it. The winter passed into spring, and with it came changes both subtle and profound. Word spread through Rattlesnake Hollow that Jed Colt was courting his cook, and the gossip ranged from scandalized to approving depending on who was doing the talking. But Jed and Lark ignored the gossip, focused instead on building their relationship with the same care and attention they brought to everything else they did. They took Sunday rides together, exploring the ranch boundaries and talking about everything and nothing. They worked side by side in the kitchen on quiet evenings, Jed learning to cook under Lark's patient instruction. They attended church together in town, presenting a united front against the whispers and stares. And gradually, the gossip died down, replaced by acceptance and eventually approval. People could see that this was real, that they fit together in a way that made sense. In March, word came that Gideon McKenna had left the territory entirely. He'd lost his job at the Dawson Ranch after one too many drunken incidents, and with no money and no prospects, he'd headed east, chasing rumors of work in the mines. Lark felt nothing when she heard the news. Not relief or sadness or vindication, just a mild surprise that she could feel so little about a man who'd once controlled every aspect of her life. "Do you think he'll ever come back?" she asked Jed that evening. "Maybe, but it doesn't matter if he does. He has no power over you anymore, and he knows it. That's a hard thing for a man like him to accept, so he ran rather than face it." Jed was quiet for a moment, then added, "You know, you could try to find him if you wanted, make peace, or at least get closure." "I don't need closure from him. I need distance." Lark's voice was firm. "Whatever peace I make is with myself, with who I was and who I'm becoming. He doesn't factor into that." It was true. She'd stopped waiting for her father to apologize, to change, to become someone worthy of forgiveness. She'd let go of the hope that he might one day see her as valuable, might regret how he'd treated her. Those were his failings to live with, not her burdens to carry. Spring became summer, and with the heat came roundup season, which meant even more mouths to feed and longer days in the kitchen. But Lark thrived on the challenge, and Thomas, who'd become so skilled that she'd convinced Jed to officially apprentice him as an assistant cook, helped shoulder the load. They worked like a well-oiled machine, anticipating each other's needs, moving through the kitchen in coordinated rhythm. "You know," Thomas said one particularly hot afternoon as they prepared dinner for 25 hungry cowboys, "my father's finally accepted that I'm not going to be a ranch hand. Says if I'm going to be a cook, at least I'm learning from the best." "Your father's a wise man." Lark smiled at the boy, though he wasn't really a boy anymore, she realized. He'd shot up several inches over the winter and his voice had deepened. He was becoming a man, and a skilled one at that. "You've got real talent, Thomas. In a few more years you could work anywhere you wanted. I'd rather work here if Mr. Colt will keep me on. I think that can be arranged." It was a Saturday evening in late July when Jed asked Lark to take a walk with him after supper. They strolled out past the barns and corrals, toward a small rise that overlooked the entire ranch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, and the air was finally cooling after the brutal heat of the day. "I've been thinking," Jed said when they reached the top of the rise. "We've been courting for 8 months now. People have had time to adjust to the idea of us together, and I—" He paused, seeming uncharacteristically nervous. "I don't want to court anymore, Lark. I want to marry you." Lark's heart began to race. "Is this a proposal?" "Not yet. First, I need to know, is this what you want? Not because you're grateful, not because it's practical, but because you want to spend your life with me?" His eyes searched hers. "Because I don't want you to marry me unless you're absolutely certain. You've been making your own choices for less than a year. I won't take that freedom from you by pressuring you into something you're not ready for." The care in his question, the way he prioritized her agency over his own desires, made Lark love him even more. "I'm certain," she said firmly. "I've never been more certain of anything. I love you, Jed. Not because you saved me, though you did. Not because you gave me a home, though you did that too. But because you're kind and honorable and you make me want to be brave. Because you see me as an equal, as a partner. Because when I think about the future, I can't imagine one that doesn't include you." Jed's face transformed with relief and joy. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box, opening it to reveal a simple gold band set with a small but perfect diamond. "Then, Lark McKenna, will you marry me? Will you be my wife, my partner, my home?" "Yes," Lark breathed. "Yes, absolutely yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, and she wondered how he'd managed that. And then he was kissing her, and she was kissing him back, and the sun was setting over their land, their ranch, their future. They were married in September, on a cool autumn day when the light was golden and perfect. The ceremony was held at Silver Creek itself, with half the territory in attendance. Rosa and her daughters had decorated the yard with wildflowers and ribbons, and Miguel had built an arbor from cottonwood branches. Thomas had worked for weeks preparing the wedding feast, determined to prove he could handle a major event on his own, and he'd succeeded brilliantly. Lark wore a dress of pale blue silk that Mrs. Chen had helped her choose, simple but elegant. She carried a bouquet of desert wildflowers, and her hair was loose around her shoulders the way Jed had once mentioned he liked it. She had no father to walk her down the aisle, but she'd asked Miguel to do the honor, and he'd accepted with tears in his eyes. As she walked toward Jed, who stood waiting in his best suit with his eyes full of love and promise, Lark thought about how far she'd traveled to get here. Not just the physical distance from her father's house to Silver Creek, but the internal journey from fear to freedom, from broken to whole, from surviving to thriving. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. They exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promising partnership and respect and all the ordinary happiness they could create together. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the assembled guests could probably be heard in town. The celebration lasted well into the night, with music and dancing and more food than even this crowd could finish. Lark danced with Jed, with Miguel, with Thomas, with ranch hands who'd become friends and family. She laughed until her sides hurt, and cried happy tears and felt so full of joy she thought she might burst with it. Later, when the guests had finally departed and the ranch was quiet again, Jed carried her across the threshold of the main house, their house now, officially and completely. He set her down gently in the kitchen, and they stood there for a moment, holding each other in the space that had witnessed so much of their story. "Happy?" Jed asked softly. "Deliriously," Lark said, "though I still can't quite believe this is real, that I get to keep this, keep you, keep all of it. It's real, and it's yours. We're building this life together, Lark Colt." He smiled at the sound of her new name. "Equal partners, remember?" "Equal partners," she agreed. "Though I should warn you, I'm keeping the kitchen. That's my domain. Wouldn't dream of challenging you for it. I know better than to get between a woman and her workspace." He kissed her forehead. "Come on, let's go to bed. Tomorrow starts the rest of our lives, and I want to be rested enough to appreciate every minute of it." They climbed the stairs together, hand in hand, to the room that was now theirs to share. And as Lark settled into bed beside her husband, feeling the weight of his arm across her waist, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the simple comfort of not being alone, she thought about her mother's words from all those years ago. Cooking was a kind of love language, a way of caring for people when words weren't enough. She'd spent so many years cooking out of obligation, out of fear, out of necessity. But now she cooked out of joy, out of love, out of the simple pleasure of creating something good and sharing it with people who mattered. And that made all the difference. The years that followed were marked by both challenges and triumphs, sorrows and celebrations, the ordinary ups and downs of any life well lived. Lark and Jed built their partnership day by day, learning each other's rhythms, supporting each other through difficulties, celebrating each other's victories. They expanded the ranch, hired more workers, became pillars of the community. Thomas eventually struck out on his own, opening a restaurant in Santa Fe that became famous throughout the territory. He credited Lark with teaching him everything that mattered, and he visited often, bringing new recipes and stories of his adventures. Lark never saw her father again. She heard years later that he'd died in a mining accident somewhere in Colorado, drunk and alone. She felt a distant sadness for the man he might have been, the father he could have chosen to be. But she didn't grieve for who he actually was. That man had lost the right to her tears long ago. Instead, she focused on the life she was creating, the family she was building. When her first child was born, a daughter they named Catherine, after Lark's mother, she held the tiny, perfect weight of her and made a silent promise. This child would grow up knowing she was loved, valued, free to make her own choices. She would never have to cook to earn her place at the table, would never have to make herself small to be safe. As Lark stood in the kitchen one morning, years after that first desperate walk through the darkness, she looked around at the space that had become the heart of her home. The shelves were stocked with supplies she'd chosen. The recipes pinned to the wall were ones she'd perfected. The rhythm of work was one she'd established. This was hers. Not given, not granted as a favor, but earned through skill and determination and the courage to choose herself. Through the window, she could see Jed working with the horses in the corral, could hear Catherine's laughter as she played in the yard under Rosa's watchful eye. The ranch stretched out in all directions, full of life and possibility and promise. Lark Colt, smiled and rolled up her sleeves. There was bread to be made, dinner to prepare, a family to feed. And she would do it not because she had to, not because anyone demanded it, but because she wanted to. Because cooking was love made tangible, and she had so much love to give. They tried to break her hand, her father in his rage and his desperate need for control, but she'd kept cooking anyway, kept working, kept fighting for the life she deserved. And in the end, she hadn't just survived, she'd won. She'd claimed her freedom, found her partner, built her home. The hollow wasn't empty anymore. It was full of laughter and love and the smell of bread baking, full of people who cared and work that mattered, and all the ordinary miracles of a life well lived. And that, Lark thought as she kneaded dough with both strong hands, was everything she'd ever needed.